Richard had his own principles and thoughts. Although he wanted to become friends with Mountainsea, he wasn't going to use any of that vast wealth of hers. His mother had molded his ethics when he was young, and the shadow of Gatton Arcaran loomed over him in the present. Before sending him to the deep blue, Gatton had once said something that was deeply imprinted within his mind: every Arcaran has a burning arrogance inside them. Rather than asking for help from others, they would rather use their own two hands to break new ground. Of course, this comes with pros and cons. The cons are that the Arcarans will forever find it difficult to band together. However, the pros are that every successful Arcaran will be feared by others. Silvermoon elves were obviously proud as well, but it came with detachment and arrogance. The pursuance of perfection which came from their very blood made it difficult for them to see anything else. These two different kinds of pride mixed into one within Richard, and he himself had no idea whether he was more like the Silvermoon elves or the Arcarans. He rolled up the hide once more and set out to seal the magic material. Unless he kept it in a semi-plane, if the hide was not sealed and stored with magic, the magical force within it would gradually dissipate. At this moment, however, Richard found that there was a slight power flowing around the dragon hide, which he immediately linked to the barbarian girl through its desolate aura. She hadn't added any forces to the hide when she'd used it as a shawl, only doing so when she gifted it to Richard to ensure that the magic inside wouldn't dissipate. Who knew that someone who charged around everywhere without regard could be so attentive? Richard subconsciously flashed a small smile. He then cautiously placed it on the top rack of the magic material warehouse. That afternoon, his schedule was filled with classes. However, time flew by, and soon enough it was lunchtime. Richard saw lunch and dinner every day as a battle. Although his diet was no longer modulated by the legendary mage herself, it was still being modified every now and then by the best alchemist of the deep blue. The similarity between the two was that the ingredients used were equally expensive, and the portions equally astounding, which was why two strong, tan slaves were now needed to bring him his meals. Returning to the residence, Richard was surprised to see Mountainsea waiting for him at his door. Behind her were only Steelrock, the old man, and two court guards. After bringing the girl and her people inside, Richard's lunch was also sent over by two tan slaves. After the food was arranged properly, the girl immediately made a squeal of enjoyment and sat by the table. "Treat me to a meal. Treat me to a meal." "Of course," Richard replied, wanting to be friends with her. He also called out to Steelrock and the old man, but was tactfully rejected by the barbarian warriors. The gigantic Steelrock seemed to treat everyone with disdain, but it looked like he had a good attitude towards Richard. After being invited to eat, Mountainsea did not hesitate. She immediately made her move, using her hands and not bothering with the 10 kinds of exquisite cutlery available on the table. Whether it was the dragon ribs or the turtle shell, all were easily torn into pieces and tossed into her mouth, which she swallowed after chewing and crunching. Even the boiling hot soup and its ingredients were all poured into her mouth. No matter what was inside, they were all swallowed in a gulp. Her teeth seemed to be able to crush all substances in the world, and the dragon bone and turtle shell appeared to her as mere crispy kernels or nuts. The old man expressed his desire to see the residence of a legendary mage's disciple, and Richard happily allowed them to move around as they wished. All the information he had here was on the basics of magic and was no secret in the Norland continent. He returned to the table after taking care of the old man and Steelrock, only to freeze upon seeing that Mountainsea had finished everything. He'd only spoken a few words during that time. Mountainsea looked at the empty plates, and even she felt a little sorry. While this place isn't all that good in other areas, the food is not bad. The girl stood up and pulled at Richard, saying, "How about you come to my camp? My people went to the sea to fish last night. If you go now, you can eat sharks and even devil whales." You don't stay in the deep blue? Richard was rather curious. Of course not. What's good about this place? You can only see the mountains and seas outside through such a tiny window. I like being able to see the sky right after I wake up.
Flow Bay is actually very magnificent and almost measures up to my hometown.
Why do you hole yourself up in such a tiny cage? Richard found this funny, though he could not say much after seeing Mountainsea looking so sincere. Forget winter, even at the beginning of spring or late in autumn people freeze to death here, he'd wanted to say, but from the looks of it the girl had no idea about what cold was. Richard could only refuse her invitation. No, I have to meet Master this afternoon, but... Mountainsea made a sound of surprise and suddenly remembered, stating, I have an appointment with her this afternoon too, I'd almost forgot about that. Actually, it doesn't matter whether I see her, but since you're going, let's go together. Though there was still some time before the appointment, Richard had no plans to get food elsewhere. He could only use the internal communications system and ask the people who sent meals over to bring a few light refreshments when they came to clean up. He then found a place with a wide view by the large French window and began to chat with Mountainsea. The girl talked about the glory of the barbarian world. From her narrations, Richard learnt that they lived on a huge island at the east of Norland called the Desolate Continent. This was because in terms of surface area, it could already be considered a continent. The native tribes that lived there called this continent Clander, the land of the new heroes. Richard also mentioned the great life he'd had in Rusland. Although it was the life of people who lived at the very bottom in the continent, Mountainsea listened on with keen interest. At this point, Steelrock and the old man had completed touring Richard's residence once. Steelrock's gaze swept through the various magic materials and books, even secretly taking a thick and dulled planar geometry book from the bookshelf and flipping through it. There were many notes wedged inside, in which Richard had written his thoughts. Every note only had 1 or 2 lines, but there were a fair number of them accumulated throughout the book. Steelrock placed the book back and used his fingers that were as thick as a steel pillar and lightly grasped a book on magic theory. After flipping through it, he found a similar set of notes and nodded, before pushing it back on the bookshelf. Compared to normal humans, Steelrock was basically a giant, but his current movements were surprisingly agile, not leaving behind a single trace. The old man stood in front of Richard's work table, bending over as he looked carefully at one of Richard's incomplete ideas for a rune. The large parchment paper spread on the table was filled with countless numbers and formulas, as well as 2 rough drawings of parts of a magic formula. The final structure was yet to be completed, and there was still some calculations and validating formulas to be done. An incomplete concept like this was something no runemaster would be interested in taking another look at. Yet, the old man stood still in front of the table, as if he had a great interest in these dull numbers. Steelrock headed to the old man's side and glanced at the table. Obviously unimpressed by the numbers, he immediately began to frown. This is a rune? It's far from our saint totems. This kid is diligent, frugal, and disciplined, but he's quite poor. This rune seems incomplete. Look, there's a fatal flaw here in this formula. The old man shook his head. Whether an eagle can soar into the blue skies is obvious from the moment it flaps its wings from its nest. But Steelrock rubbed his gigantic palms together. This kid will be an eagle in the future? The old man did not answer, and instead said, It's time to meet Her Excellency, Sharon. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 49. Meeting. On the other side of the residence, Richard and Mountainsea were getting increasingly engrossed in their conversation. She was enthusiastically recounting glorious hunts in recent years, where she'd captured mammoths alone in the cold. It was at this point that Richard realized something was amiss. Hold on, he asked in disbelief, you're a warrior, dot. Her reply indicated she'd expected this, of course. The elders even say I could be the heir to all totemic warriors in the future. Richard grew slightly confused. Then can you learn magic? I mean, won't there be clashes with your path that slow you down if you try to learn both at the same time? He fumbled around for the right words to say, hoping not to hurt her pride. Why would I want to learn magic? It's so complicated and useless. "Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't talking about you." She stuck her tongue out in apology, but the gaze she had fixed on his lips was one of a glutton. Richard immediately turned around, a subconscious reaction that told Mountainsea she'd exposed herself. She immediately sat upright, explaining with a straight face, "Magic really is of no use to me. I can destroy spells below grade 5 with a single slap already, and it's virtually impossible to lock me down with grade 6 spells either. Besides, I'm still young and inexperienced. When I get older, I'll be able to avoid or block stronger and stronger spells." Even though Richard already knew that Mountainsea's strength was formidable, he hadn't expected it to be so great. It looked like Clander was no weaker than Norland.
Alright then. If you're not planning to learn magic, why did you become an apprentice of master?
Twirling her finger around one of her braids, Mountainsea answered as though it were common knowledge, "Because Her Excellency is a legendary mage. I just wanted to find someone of that level for a mentor, not her particularly. With her addition, I'll have 3 legendary mentors now, and my mother and grandma on top."
The elders said it's for background, something you Norlanders consider very important.
"Even if I don't learn anything here, it's worth spending some money to come to the Deep Blue for the background.
In your words, this is Steel Rock."
The small hill of a barbarian warrior jogged over, leaning down to Mountainsea's ear with much difficulty. He tried to whisper softly, "It's called gold plating."
"Gold plating?" She asked in return, "Why gold? Isn't it everywhere? Wouldn't magic iron jade from the ninth abyss make for a better image?" The barbarian warrior evidently hadn't thought this through before.
He rubbed his hands together awkwardly, trying to find a reasonable explanation for the thing. Maybe gold is considered expensive and precious in Norland. "Look, everything here is priced in gold." Mountainsea finally seemed to understand. No wonder the elders said spider crystals and gold were 2 completely different things in Norland.
"Exactly," Steel Rock exclaimed, impressed by the girl's wisdom.
Even though Richard felt that something was amiss, he could not quite point it out. If black gold were here, he would have been able to criticize the barbarian's ignorance with irrefutable evidence. The smaller units of currency weren't the same as items of more value. Spider crystals would never replace gold coins. Regardless, even black gold would have to admit that gold coins and spider crystals were in entirely different realms.
The time to meet the legendary mage arrived in a flash. Sharon was someone who always paid attention to punctuality, when it came to others, of course.
She herself had an ironic lack of the same, something very dragon-like. An hour or 2 of delay from sleep was quite common, and most of the Grand Mages were understanding of the situation. After all, the legendary mage couldn't possibly waste any time. Even sleep was a good time for her mana to grow. She was the root of the Deep Blue's foundation with her vast and profound abilities. In general, other people in unique situations who were there to meet the legendary mage wouldn't mind waiting for her for a couple of hours. That afternoon, Richard and Mountainsea had both good and bad luck. On the good end, the mage was already up when they went to visit. On the other hand, she hadn't woken up on her own. The legendary mage had scheduled the meeting with both Richard and Mountainsea in the same venue, a small reception hall. Less than 200 square meters in size, it was one of the most modest halls in her private residence. At the moment, the legendary mage had been lying on the wooden couch, her leg perched high on the armrest. Her left hand was extended across the seat, her fingers occasionally reaching for the fruits in the golden basket. As though moving on their own, the fruits landed in the legendary mage's mouth one by one, disappearing within. Her posture wasn't the least bit elegant, but with her porcelain arms and calves the visual impact was strong enough to ignore her lack of grace. Sharon's eyes were half open, but the shiny pupils lacked focus. Anyone who knew her would understand that this was a sign of her being half asleep, and this was exactly the time when she was at her most dangerous. The sweet and melodious sound had been echoing throughout the reception hall for a while. Although it contained an awakening power, this was completely lost on the legendary mage. Her eyelids were drooping, as if she was going to continue her endless nap. Just then, a strand of her hair suddenly stood up like it had a spirit of its own, looking around vigilantly. It started to tremble more violently, before jumping up straight and causing the mage much pain. She let out a cry before sitting up. Her eyes thus fully opened, pupils blazing with fury. A colorful breath came spewing out of her tall nose bridge, containing unbreakable elemental energy. The elements in the air seemed to arouse in a split second, cheering as they danced towards the legendary mage. They formed a mysterious trail around her, seemingly prepared to obey her orders. Sharon looked around for an enemy with an electrifying gaze, only to find not a soul in sight. All that was here was the snacks and fruits, no target needing destruction. Sharon glanced at the constant ringing of the clock, seeing the strand of her hair fall down to rest. She suddenly started laughing, a few small knocks to the armrest of her couch setting off a dozen such clocks at the same time. This was a signal, summoning the Grand Mages of the Deep Blue to an emergency meeting. 17 Grand Mages filed in a moment later, a group of dark elves moving their respective chairs into position. Sharon drummed her nails, indicating to the attendant outside to bring the visitors into the hall. Mountainsea pulled Richard into the hall affectionately, Steelrock, the elder, and 2 other palace guards following closely behind as well. Not all visitors were allowed to bring their attendants into the hall, this had only be done today by Sharon's orders. The legendary mage's eyes instantly brightened as the line of visitors entered the hall. Her squinty eyes scanned past Steelrock, the elder, and the palace guards one by one. There was nothing peculiar about Steelrock and the guards at all, and although the elder's steps were a tad slowed, he immediately kept pace with Mountainsea. The 17 Grand Mages involuntarily straightened their bodies, undercurrents of mana flowing in the air. Their experience allowed them to see that the 2 guards were level 18, with Steelrock being even higher. In such close proximity, just those 3 would be able to kill them all if they didn't have their guards up. Moreover, there was still that elder at the side, who even they couldn't see through. On top of that, even if the girl looked young and delicate, she exuded a wild and desolate aura of toughness that made her seem like a young beast. Since the legendary mage seldom called for emergency meetings, the Grand Mages knew that unexpected events must have occurred. Now that they saw the girl's wild entourage, everyone could sense the tense atmosphere. What bewildered the mages was why the legendary mage did not bother to hide her hostility when Richard seemed to be so close to the barbarian girl. Those who were meticulous would have put 2 and 2 together to link her fury to the day of destiny. Richard felt a strange and stifling atmosphere once he stepped into the hall, an omen of an impending thunderstorm. He raised his head to meet Sharon's piercing gaze, immediately being stumped for words. Sensing something wasn't right, he quietly pulled his hand backwards. Much to his relief, Mountainsea released his hand and bowed politely to Sharon and the group of Grand Mages, before retreating to a corner. Her unexpected consideration took Richard by surprise. Given her immense strength, had she not wanted to let go, he would have been unable to get away no matter how hard he struggled. Mountainsea walked up to Sharon, and automatically took a seat in the large couch directly opposite her. Leaning backwards and finding a comfortable position, she was no less imposing than the legendary mage. Sharon squinted her eyes, asking, "And you are?" "You can call me Mountainsea, I'm the paying student." "Are you my mentor?" The girl replied naturally, her imposing manner on equal footing with Sharon's. "My student?" The legendary mage laughed wryly. "Although I don't really care about the aptitude of students who pay for themselves, you're a barbarian warrior who's the inheritor of the sacred totems. Why would you learn magic from me? If I recall correctly, the greatest power of your totems is the abolishment of magic." "Ah, I don't have plans to learn magic from you at all. I came to the Deep Blue because you were a legendary mage, so I could goldplate. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 50. Collision Course. Mountainsea didn't forget about gold-plating the second time, treating the word casually. She'd remembered to be respectful to her new teacher, but didn't notice the legendary mage's face darken. Of course, even if she had noticed anything, she would have continued to speak.
Sharon laughed all of a sudden, her eyes crinkling into charming crescents as the haze dissipated. Gold plating? Just because I'm a legendary mage? Mountainsea nodded in reply, yes. You included, I'll have 3 legendary teachers to boost my background.
Sharon smiled elegantly in response. Who are the other 2? One is the elder of my tribe, and the other is the sword saint of the Millennial Empire, Mountainsea answered with delight, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ears and tilting her petite face.
Nobody would have thought this girl from Clander could exude such a ladylike aura. Sharon let out a laugh. You're saying you have connections to Empress Jelen of the Millennial Empire? She's my grandmother.
Sharon's smile froze for an instant, but she returned to her normal self. She glared at Black Gold, but the Grey Dwarf only reciprocated with a look of innocence. The information about this new student had been handed down to Sharon long ago, but knowing the legendary mage, she'd only read the numbers within and ignored everything else. Sharon stretched her slender hand out and grabbed an aquatic fruit that was bigger than her hand. She flicked its shell off easily, revealing flawless flesh within. She peeled one petal off and popped it into her mouth. I heard the Millennial Empire has the bloodline of high-grade elves. How did they get a granddaughter like you?
You came from the Clander continent not long ago.
Oh right, the 3rd prince of your empire, the youngest of your 4 best generals, Greyhawk, led a 50,000-man army on an expedition to Clander decades ago, is it?
Oh.
Not long after he landed on Clander, he led his army to battle with the brave warriors of my tribe at the Eaglefall Plains, but it didn't take long for my mother's totemic warriors to take him down and capture him. She only wanted to scare them, so she released all the men a few days later, but the prince ended up becoming my father. A crunchy sound came from Sharon's mouth as she shattered the seeds of the fruit with her teeth. She remained expressionless as she swallowed, as if the fruit was seedless. Sometimes the legendary mage had equivalent bite force to a dragon. That's saying that your mother is a legendary being too. For legendary beings behind your back, not bad at all. Mountainsea nodded, yes, and with you it will be 5. The elder said a background like that will make me formidable almost anywhere in Norland. I'll just need to mention it whenever I get into trouble and the enemy will retreat in fear.
No fighting needed. Sharon cackled and spoke in a weird voice. Why is it that it feels like you're using 4 legendary beings to suppress me? That's why you're not giving me any respect. So, let's see, is any one of you standing behind her interested in fighting me?
Beams of light shot out of Sharon's eyes, her blonde hair rising into the air.
The light was so blinding that one couldn't see her face. Remaining seated, the legendary mage scanned the 4 people standing behind Mountainsea.
The 2 guards groaned as the force sent them flying 10 meters away, as if an invisible hammer had struck them hard. They were slammed into the wall, sliding down to the ground after the impact. Steelrock had to move a few steps back as well before he yelled and steadied himself, about to charge as he glared at Sharon with a bloody nose. Only the old man stood still, but that did not stop his hair flying backwards as if being blown by the wind. The 2 bone accessories that were hung on his neck exploded loudly, giving out a thin white smog. A helpless smile surfaced on the face of the old man as he opened his eyes, dried lips moving like he wanted to say something. But his movements were as slow as ever, unlike the legendary mage who spoke so speedily.
Before the old man even said anything, Sharon had already spoken a handful. Finally exposed. Though we have not met before, the aura of the ancient beast cannot fool me. You woke me up from my nap. Shaman Yurazadzu, is it? What are you doing here instead of staying in the shrine of the vast Dome River located in the Great Snow Mountains? It looks like you want to fight. Sharon waved violently at the Grand Mages. Get out. My beloved guests shouldn't complain that I won because of numbers.
Hey, old man, you've already been in the legendary realm for about 50 years now. Don't accuse me of taking advantage of you if you lose.
And that big thing, you can join too.
Those 2 useless ones won't be able to stand for a while. The grand mages looked at each other, but no one moved.
They finally understood why Sharon always called them over urgently whenever she met with guests.
It was to show off her strength and guarantee numbers if it came to a fight. The legendary mage was confident in the current matchup, so she only needed them to be an audience. Sharon finally stood up in the midst of the chaos and rubbed her hands together, excitement filling her eyes.
It's been a while since I've had a good fight. I hear you barbarians prefer fighting over talking.
I'm not in the best mood today, so let's end it quickly.
Attack now, or I will.
Urazadza hit his staff against the ground and stopped Steelrock, who was ready to attack. He shook his head, saying, "Your Excellency, the reason I'm here is to protect the girl. It's also to show you our greatest sincerity. If our only purpose was to find any legendary mage as a teacher for Mountainsea, we wouldn't have given up such a huge sum."
Sharon's expression relaxed a little.
The shaman was right. If the girl only wanted status, the price of 2 million coins would be able to get almost any legendary mage that she wanted.
Not every mage had the ability to accumulate wealth like she did.
The shaman saw the hesitation in Sharon's eyes, and quickly took the chance. Not all legendary mages qualify to teach Mountainsea.
Honestly, the final list was very narrow.
Oh?
How many?
He'd managed to hook her successfully.
2.
The number took Sharon by surprise, but she was obviously delighted. The other was definitely the Sword Saint of the Millennial Empire, and that truly was someone comparable to her. This meant the Azure Snow Shrine and Empress Jelen disregarded all the other legendary mages on the continent. There may have been other reasons behind this choice as well, but Sharon couldn't care less about that.
Well, old man, even though you disturbed my nap, you have great taste blessed by the beast god, not bad at all. The payment showed your sincerity well enough. Right, Mountainsea, why is your name so odd? It doesn't seem like a Clander name.
Sharon's gaze towards Mountainsea had grown much gentler. Of course, this was not due to Urazadza's words, instead being about the price. The huge sum was enough to soften the legendary mage greatly. Having just been woken up, the legendary mage's mood had been poor. It was only now that they were facing the true Sharon. Mountainsea's answer this time was different from the one she'd given Richard. "The elders told me only the height of the mountains and the depth of the seas can qualify to describe my wealth."
Sharon covered her mouth and laughed demurely. "Wealth that could only be described by mountains and seas? So you're saying that you're richer than me?"
It was a really cold joke. The Grand Mages could only force out a laugh or two to show support for their master. Only the Grey Dwarf had a twisted expression on his face, stuck between laughing and crying. Mountainsea nodded as expected, replying in her usual straightforward way, "I'm a student of yours who's paying for herself. It only makes sense that I have more money. 10 million is nothing, you don't have to take it to heart. Of course, I understand why gold plating is preferred to plating with abyssal iron jade in Norland."
Sharon's smile froze, and she raised her brows and asked with a sweet voice, "You said you're richer than me?"
"Of course."
Mountainsea nodded furiously.
"If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible."
Book 1, Chapter 51. Collision.
Sharon was about to say something, but then she saw a few black crystals on Mountainsea's braid as the girl nodded. Her stomach immediately dropped. Those were Isla diamonds, one of the most prized spatial crystals. This item was beyond rare, not something that could be acquired with money. Even if one traded for it with magic crystals, they'd still have to bank on their luck. Materials like these usually only traded for others of the same grade. Sharon herself only had about a dozen of these diamonds, but there were 7 on Mountainsea's braid. The legendary mage continued to scan the girl's other braids, her vision unsurpassable when she was serious. And just as expected, crystal dragon tooth, millennial unicorn horn, phoenix crown feather. These were things of similar rarity to the Isla diamonds. What really shocked her was the sheer skill required to shrink items like dragon teeth and unicorn horns to a tenth of their original size to turn them into mere accessories. She suddenly felt her head spinning. If one were to take all the accessories to Mountainsea's hair and sell them, they would be worth over 100 million coins. But the problem was, even if one had that much money, there wasn't normally any outlet to buy such items. Sharon couldn't bear the thought of carrying that much money on her head. It wasn't like she was intimidated by just this much, she had her own collection of rare items. But the very fact that all this was just in Mountainsea's braid implied that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Maybe, just maybe, her wealth really could only be described by mountains and seas. Sharon swallowed whatever words she was about to say, the peculiarity in her expression growing impossible to hide. The feeling of defeat she exuded could suddenly be felt from miles away, her imposing aura withering. She finally stretched out and waved her hand, the golden pot of fruits flying before Mountainsea in no time. "There! Mountainsea, these are for you. Stay as long as you want to, and look for black gold if you need anything. He's that gray dwarf over there. I have urgent matters that I need to see to right now, and I'm not sure when I'll be back. Don't wait for me." Before getting any replies, Sharon opened a teleportation portal on the spot and disappeared from the place. "I will pay my fees," Mountainsea shouted in Sharon's wake. In that moment, everyone looking at that departing back had an illusion that the legendary mage's mood changed for the better. The grand mages left one after another, but all of them cast inexplicable gazes at Mountainsea. Black Gold alone stayed, his eyes overflowing with adulations for the girl. Said girl was in no hurry to leave, she stayed behind and cleared the pot of fruits Sharon left for her at lightning speed. Within a minute the pot was wiped clean, and she stared with dissatisfaction at the empty pot as she licked her lips. This obviously wasn't enough to satisfy her. The gray dwarf immediately said, "There are more fruits. As long as you pay the school fees." A spider crystal came flying and hit the gray dwarf, making him swallow whatever he was about to say. Mountainsea waved her hand dismissively, "Get 50 pots to my room." And then turned and looked at Steelrock and the old man before saying, "Another 50 for them too, send them to our campsite on the beach. Do it daily." Mountainsea was strikingly similar to Sharon in terms of appetite. If one went by the legendary mage's theory of appetite determining power, this young girl would surely become a legendary being, maybe even surpassing that level. And thus Richard was left forgotten in the corner, his own future still a mystery. "That won't be a problem at all," the gray dwarf replied loudly. He was holding onto the spider crystal with both hands, his movements growing rigid again. Thankfully he was still in the right state of mind as he asked, "But, Your Highness, you don't have a residence in the Deep Blue yet. Should I get one for you?" "No need for the trouble. I'll just stay with him for my duration in the Deep Blue." Mountainsea directed her finger at Richard. Richard was stunned. The gray dwarf could sense something amiss too, but the spider crystal was so bright that he did not raise any objections towards her suggestion. Richard's own opinion? Nobody asked for that. The girl stood up and said that to old man, "Weird, didn't elders say that we need to bring out our profile and background when dealing with people of status, and that money is only used to bribe second-rate people? Why is Mentor not afraid of my background but rather my wealth?" She could feel the gray dwarf's hesitation from the side and prompted him, "Say what's on your mind." The gray dwarf spoke as softly as possible, Actually, Her Excellency can tolerate people who are stronger than her, but not people who are richer than her. So I'm guessing that she's out to earn more now." Mountainsea was flabbergasted. "Do you need any effort in earning money? Just dig the mines in the mountains." "Shaman, what do you think about this?" Urizadzu touched his bare chin and smiled. "Your granny found you a cute mentor." Mountainsea nodded in full agreement. "Yes. And Mentor smells really good as well. I want to take a bite of her. Just wait till the day when I can beat her, but it won't be a long wait." "Just half a," the gray dwarf muttered under his breath, but the young girl had heard everything. Richard felt iffy about the whole situation the moment Mountainsea mentioned smell, quickly backing away and leaving this bizarre place. The competition against Stephen was due soon, and he didn't have the time to take an extra shower with his packed schedule. He didn't want Mountainsea to be added on top of all this. Moreover, he was already a man, and naturally knew that Mountainsea staying over would upset Sharon. He got shivers just thinking about the mage's bright, blinding eyes. However, with her departure, the girl suddenly became the most influential power in the Deep Blue. She could probably do anything she wanted now, and the Grey Dwarf had betrayed Sharon right before his eyes to join her side. Richard found it hard to deal with this genuine friend of his. I guess I'll hide, he thought, but before he could take even 2 steps forward, Mountainsea had emerged before him. She was all smiles, and her eyes lingered on his lips. All unrelated personnel looked away at that moment, acting like they could not see anything. However, they kept their ears alert. Ugh! Richard let out a suffocating noise, but then a slap sounded, followed by a roar of fury. What do you think you're doing? What he got in reply was a satisfied ring in the girl's voice. Why are you angry? It's just a kiss. You don't lose anything from it. Richard, can you give me a gift again tonight? Hey! Why are you running? You think you can run away with my gift? On that very night, Mountainsea moved into Richard's place. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 52. Days Together. Richard knew all of the Deep Blue's laws. One could throw a trespasser out by brute force, and they would not have to compensate for any injuries incurred or damage sustained. The law effectively allowed one to deal with intruders as they liked, but he got shivers at the mere thought of Mountainsea's abilities and immediately crossed out that idea. Another way was to lodge a complaint to Black Gold, whereafter the enforcers would teach the intruders the law. But would that really work out? Telling that Grey Dwarf about this girl? He removed this thought from his mind as well. That was how Richard realized that the supposed laws of the Deep Blue were pretty much useless before someone with strength and status like Mountainsea. It was thus that the two began living together. The girl moved in alone, only bringing a handful of clothes along. Steelrock, that old man, and her other guards did not follow. Nobody would know what went on once the door closed. Of course, if anything violent were to happen, Richard would not be the cause. That night, a bonfire illuminated the campsite of the barbarians, and fresh whale was being roasted atop it. The grease from the whale dripped into the dancing flames, making them sizzle. Warriors and young girls alike danced in a circle around the bonfire, to the tune of horns, drums, and flutes in the backdrop. The music was intense, its strong rhythm pulling the audience into dancing to it. These people simply had far too much to celebrate about, for instance their most beloved princess receiving a gift. Steelrock and the Elder were sat in the corner, enjoying drinks and meat. It took entire barrels of alcohol for Steelrock to let out a satisfied sigh, that Richard lad is pretty fine, but he's still too young. With Mistress so close to him, will there be any issues? The old man laughed in reply. Steelrock, did you forget Mistress's unique innate ability? What she's really fond of is the smell of Richard's bloodline. It's quite rare for someone to have the blood of both devils and elves. Devils and elves? Well, that's rare, but nothing special, right? Steelrock scratched his head in confusion. The old man shook his head. No, it's not that straightforward. It is almost impossible for two pure bloodlines to crossbreed. And by right, the strength of a hybrid's blood grows weaker by the generations, and they won't be easy to spot after a while. That boy is strange. I felt an unknown strength lurking within him, but couldn't determine its nature. Someone covered it up, maybe Sharon, maybe someone else, but that bloodline ability of his is only the start. His soul is pure and forthright, and he has many essential abilities that could guarantee his ascent. That makes sense. Honestly, after traveling to so many places in Norland, I've rarely seen anyone who can't be knocked down with money. Sharon is one, and this young boy is another, Steelrock praised. Were the legendary mage present, she would have first grown elated before beating this cunning and deceitful giant up for playing a fool in front of her. The old man raised his head to the starry night of Flo Bay, the 5 moons in the sky unable to steal its limelight. We don't have to worry. The beast god will lead mistress to the people she should get close to. Urizazu lifted his cup and drank everything in one shot. The days with Mountainsea were a bizarre but unforgettable experience. There were only 3 things in her daily routine. She was either eating, sleeping, or clinging to Richard. She never set aside time for practice, instead wasting her days away like someone who really fitted the definition of gold-plated. Richard was somewhat worried about Mountainsea. Since she'd already spent millions of coins to become Sharon's pupil, he thought she might as well make full use of it. Learning something was better than learning nothing at all, and she should have served her money well. But these coins were worthless in the girl's eyes. She told Richard that she didn't need to train specifically as long as she had enough food and sleep to grow. Richard's first reaction upon hearing that was to stare at his schedule for a long time, before he eventually focused on an experiment to put an end to the conversation. Talking to Mountainsea was normally a pleasure, but sometimes it really pushed his buttons. Mountainsea pushed away the plates in front of her, following Richard to the lab before curling up in a large chair for her afternoon nap. These days, the only thing that satisfied her in Deep Blue was eating, that included Richard's meals and Sharon's fruits. For the first 3 days she'd moved in, Richard had never been full. His meals had grown to 10 kilos by virtue of Sharon, but even if the alchemists wanted to double his meals, several of the rare ingredients in them had short shelf lives. They usually had to order these foods a month or 2 early, and the cooking took a lot of effort as well. They used up all their reserves, but they couldn't bring out any more. At one point, they thought about bringing out other food items for Mountainsea, but she looked at the plates and gagged in a disgusting manner, just like a picky child. Before she could say anything, Steelrock had done the work for her, yelling at Blackgold as the dwarf thoroughly wiped his sweat and promised that both of them would have similar treatment in regards to meals in the future. In Blackgold's eyes, Steelrock's brown skin had started to glow emerald like that of his mistress. On the 3rd day, Sharon, who was earning money on another plane, sent a message back with a menu. Thus, from the 4th day, Mountainsea had her own personalized lunch and dinner. The girl resembled a house cat ever since then, looking forward to mealtimes every day. Richard could never figure out how she could finish a 50 kilograms meal within 3 minutes, just like he could not figure how Sharon was perpetually eating fruits. Their stomachs seemed to be spatial voids. Regardless, he could finally have a meal that filled his own stomach. Mountainsea's preferences were rather bizarre, and the meal that Sharon curated for her smelled strong and grotesque. The girl did offer some to Richard, but he lost all appetite the moment he took a whiff of the food. The girl herself found it strangely tasty, using both her hands to sweep through the box like a tornado. She would leave deep tooth marks in the cutlery, especially ones from her canines, even if it was all made of stainless steel. They changed it into carbon steel the next day, but with even that failing they switched to high carbon steel used to make shields. They then tried Laphite steel on the 4th, the same material used in Rune Knight's breastplates. The destruction only stopped on the 5th day, when they changed to obsidian. Only a handful of even Rune Knights qualified to have weapons made out of this material. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 53. Days Together. It took Richard a while to realize Mountainsea's secret. She wasn't really particular about the taste the food offered, no. What interested her instead was the amount of nutrients packed within. The discovery made him feel like she'd even gnaw on magic crystals if she could. Outside of eating, the most important part of her life seemed to be sleep. This was especially true just after meals, when she'd immediately fall into deep sleep. She slept as Richard meditated, worked, and studied, only leaving him to play in some unknown corner of the Deep Blue when he had lessons to attend. Most of the time, she was within 5 meters of him. She continued to abide by the laws, taking up just enough classes as was required for a personal apprentice of the legendary mage, but the only use of this timetable of hers was in calculating her monthly payments. She also didn't seem to understand the meaning of reservations. She never tried to avoid Richard, even when she showered, so he had to get used to her beautiful slender body. Her emerald skin was glossy like silk, and looked so tender to the touch it made his imagination run wild. On top of everything, her long straight legs were enough to make any man go crazy. Richard was already a man, so sleeping next to her was a nightly torture. She couldn't keep her hands to herself in bed, taking every chance she could to lie on Richard's chest. She'd eventually end up wrapped around him, leaving their private parts in close proximity. At the peak of his vitality, with an ever-hungry bloodline and food curated specifically for such purposes, it was unbearable for him to be so close to her. "We're just friends," he muttered to himself whenever he failed to fall asleep, suppressing the urge to press down on the unrivaled beauty with overflowing youthfulness. Sometimes he looked at her face in sound sleep and comforted himself, "This isn't my choice." He didn't realize that he didn't lose energy during the day despite the restless sleep, nor was his progress slowed. He also didn't understand the danger of trying to subdue the girl until a mosquito flew nearby one day. Mosquitoes were exotic creatures. It was impossible to keep them out even as a legendary mage, and they existed even in the deep blue. However, as the particular mosquito barreled towards Mountainsea's face under Richard's close scrutiny, it was only able to reach a meter's radius of her before a soft pop left it vanished into thin air. All that was left in its wake was a faint green trail of smoke. It had left him in cold sweat. For her first few days moved in, Mountainsea disappeared whenever Richard had classes. She said she performed all kinds of activities, including fishing with her tribe. However, she seemed more and more disinterested in such things as time passed, spending increasing amounts of time with Richard. She was even following him to classes. Urizadzu and Steelrock were hardly seen as well, and her guards seemed to be enjoying a rare vacation. However, this caused the Grey Dwarf, who was observing everything quietly, to grow more nervous. The responsibility for Mountainsea's safety had just fallen on his shoulders. Putting his duty and the possible consequences aside, the Deep Blue's annual finances were dependent on Mountainsea as well, and that was enough to make Blackgold more careful than ever. Personally, too, every time he looked at Mountainsea it was like seeing the largest and most abundant mine of his life. His feelings for her were beyond worship and adoration. As long as this mine so much as walked past him, he would be up in the clouds for a long while. So the Grey Dwarf decided to give his all in protecting Mountainsea, especially increasing the number of enforcers around Richard's residence and public areas twofold, as well as adding a fully equipped rune knight to the patrol. The number of mages that were on duty, the sentry points on each level, were also doubled, and the 17 grand mages were stationed at the ground floor of the tower so they could take immediate action in case of emergency. The borders of the Deep Blue were surrounded by a dark aura, and many in the gray areas of life were alerted as the atmosphere around them grew more tense. It was as if a pair of invisible eyes was posted at every dark corner, staring at them, watching their every move. The street rats were hypersensitive to any possible danger, and the Grey Dwarf had added 1,000 magic eyes at the borders in one go. That may have been a little too much, but the message was clear, and it also brightened up the Grey districts. A few rats seemed unable to get a hold of the situation, still going on the hunt even if they sensed danger, thinking that they were invincible. However, curiosity was a deadly weapon. Any that ventured out disappeared without a trace into the gloomy night, as if they'd never even existed. Any who dared find trouble with the Grey Dwarf at this critical juncture would realize the fear his drunken kin inspired when enraged. The Grey Dwarf did not need a warning accompanied by great fanfare. The disappearances were notice enough. Eventually, all the mice went back to hiding in their nests. Naya's mood hadn't been pleasant the last few days. The bloody smell lingering in his kitchen would take a long time to fade, and the putrid stench turned his dishes foul. It also added a weird smell to the wine stored in the cellar. Truth be told, the longer one stayed in the underworld, the more they would grow to hate the smell of blood. The only exceptions were perverts. Another reason for Naya's mood was that he'd already done so much for black gold, but the dwarf hadn't allowed him to pay a single coin less in tax. The Grey Dwarf had felt it inappropriate for the enforcers to step into the borders with nothing having happened, so the dirty work was left to the Blade of Calamity and his brothers. His dagger that had been used to execute major characters had been stained by rat's blood. Even killers had their dignity, and when Naya complained to Black Gold that he couldn't take it anymore, the dwarf only replied with, "If the times have changed." The times changed, yes, but the tax never did. That was something the Grey Dwarf knew to be unwritten rules. This had gotten an angry reprimand from Naya. Unwritten rules, what utter bullshit. He cursed, of course only in secret and after the Grey Dwarf left. He had no choice but to continue searching earnestly for the rats that didn't know better, feeling his heart ache at the amount of tax he would have to pay the month. His monthly tax was already greater than the yearly profits of his small tavern. Naya was still willing to do this sort of tough work for the dwarf, however, because Black Gold possessed immeasurable power. And indeed, he couldn't escape the pursuit of the legendary mage either. But the true reason he was willing to work so hard was that he'd already fallen deeply in love with the peace and stability in the Deep Blue. He loved to watch Richard grow under his guidance, day by day by day. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 54. Days Together. To be fair, the Deep Blue was relatively safe, especially around the main tower. Men like Stephen were in the minority, with few being formidable enough to take such risks that could endanger one's own life. However, he was still living well in the Deep Blue, and the power of his subordinates was increasing day by day. To ensure victory in the competition, Duke Solom had sent another large army in assistance, and now the Grey Dwarf was starting to regret advocating for the warlock to stay. Mountainsea and Richard were stuck together every day, and it wouldn't be all that surprising for Stephen to dare assassinate Richard or harm Mountainsea. After all, someone who'd lost all rationale wouldn't consider the consequences of their actions. The Grey Dwarf firmly believed that Mountainsea was invincible. No matter the race, age or method of accumulating riches, someone as wealthy as Mountainsea was no doubt beyond fortunate and greatly blessed by the gods. Yet Stephen happened to be a classic example of the exact opposite. Thus, Black Gold was not worried that Mountainsea's life would be threatened, he was only worried that she would be harassed. Stuck between a rock and a hard place, the Grey Dwarf finally made a difficult choice. Stephen started to see 4 mage enforcers and 2 knights surrounding him the moment he left his residence every day, to protect him. They wouldn't leave his side at all, even in lessons. News traveled relatively fast in the Deep Blue. Everyone had become aware of Mountainsea's status and background within 2 days of her following Richard to classes. Nobody dared to joke about her name in the open anymore, and she almost stopped becoming the topic of idle conversation. Time flew by day, and the competition drew closer. The Grey Dwarf personally met Richard in the meantime and spoke to him for a long time. Describing all the hardships Sharon had to go through, he first explained how it was not easy for her to acquire the wealth she now possessed. Next, he tactfully expressed that Sharon's delight towards Richard was by far unprecedented, following which he made clear at the dire state the Deep Blue's finances were in. In the words of the Grey Dwarf, the Deep Blue practically had to be broken up tomorrow to be sold for cheap in order to repay the heavy debts. With a heavy heart, Richard was wondering if there was anything he could do for the legendary mage. Just then, the Grey Dwarf changed the topic and started singing in a high tone, telling Richard that the savior of the Deep Blue had appeared, and that was none other than Mountainsea. Finally, the Grey Dwarf jumped onto the coffee table in front of Richard. Looking him in the eye, the dwarf implored Richard in his most sincere and solemn tone, the time to repay Sharon had come. The best thing he could do for her was to be a good companion to Mountainsea, keeping her in the Deep Blue as long as possible. The girl had only reserved a month's worth of lessons the first time, and the next round of reservations was coming up soon. In addition, the Grey Dwarf also hinted that Richard should fulfill all of Mountainsea's requests to the best of his abilities, such as giving her more little gifts, since they would not be to his detriment anyway. Dumbstruck at his words, Richard started to suspect whether the Grey Dwarf had planted magic eyes around his residence. As long as Richard was willing to lend his support, the Grey Dwarf promised that he would be indebted to him forever and will help him win the competition. A downcast and sullen Richard left Blackgold's office. Although he couldn't exactly define his feelings right then, he felt like the pure, unadulterated relationship he shared with Mountainsea was tainted. He decided to forget all about the promise the moment he stepped out the door. That night, Mountainsea received a long-awaited gift after dinner relatively successfully. Of course, if Richard hadn't resisted, the process could have been called completely successful, though there wasn't much of a difference. Though pleased, Mountainsea was observant enough to realize Richard seemed to be down. Concerned, she asked, "Is something bothering you?" Richard nodded. "Willing to share?" She continued expectantly, hands on her face. This time, Richard shook his head. The girl let out a sigh before standing by his side quietly, looking at him design a new magic rune. And thus their time passed quietly, the day of the competition drawing closer and closer. Mountainsea stayed in the deep blue far beyond the original month she was supposed to, but showed no signs of leaving. Every additional day she stayed made Blackgold view Richard in a more positive light, since each day translated to a hefty amount in tuition and living expenses that relieved the deep blue of some of its heavy debts. Life was always full of coincidences. Though it seemed like Richard could wait as quietly he had been until the arrival of the competition, one day he ran into Stephen by chance at a class. This was a rare occurrence, either by purpose or not. The two of them hadn't picked the same class since the topic of the competition had been revealed. Blackgold himself had been extra careful to keep them apart in the general classes. Seeing Richard again, the dragon warlock's blood began to boil. His face darkened immediately, but he kept himself calm and collected as he instantly walked up to Richard while pulling Minnie up at his side. The dragon warlock's confidence did not come from his own subordinates. It was instead backed, literally, by the 4 mage enforcers and 2 knights behind him. Though he already knew that these were men sent by Blackgold to control and keep an eye on him, many others misunderstood the man as an elevation of the dragon warlock's position in the deep blue. After all, not even the Grand Mages warranted such high levels of protection. Thus, Stephen decided to make the best out of the misunderstanding to force Richard to give way, even if such temporary suppression held no significance in the grand scheme of things. Striding up to the center of the road, he was just about to speak before he felt an emptiness behind him. Looking back hurriedly, he found his guards standing far from him at their original positions, with no intention to follow close. All of their gazes were focused on the girl next to Richard. Puzzled, the dragon warlock immediately turned towards the girl, only to be reminded of Mountainsea's true identity and how she easily knocked him off his feet that fateful midsummer night. It was at the same time that Richard looked up and saw the dragon warlock, frowning in reaction. He didn't fear Stephen, but the youth's blood-drained face confused him. Before Richard could even react, Stephen took a large stride towards the other side of the road with Minnie by his side. Not dropping his gaze, he looked as if he had meant to cross the road in the first place. It was only when he reached the other side of the road that Stephen put on an act and turned around to glare fiercely at Richard. He was especially careful in avoiding Mountainsea. It was one thing for Duke Solem to anger Richard. Gatton hadn't yet begun his expansion that would shock everyone, but another matter altogether to incur the wrath of the Princess of the Millennial Empire. If that were to happen, Stephen had no idea what he could do. Richard, on the other hand, was stumped for words, confused by Stephen's puzzling actions. With no answer after a minute of deep consideration, it was only when his gaze fell on Mountainsea by his side that he finally understood the dragon warlock's attempt. By this time, however, Stephen had already disappeared beyond the corner of the street safely. Richard was unable to hold back a laugh, not taking the incident to heart. Since the dragon warlock had never appeared in Mountainsea's field of view, to her he was amongst the objects that could just fly away on their own. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible.
Book 1, Chapter 55. Truth and Lies. Dusk arrived once more, and a long-absent roar resounded from Stephen's residence.
Minnie curled up in a corner of the sofa without a sound, yet another fresh red handprint added to her face. In the meanwhile, a few alchemists of the Solon family were busying themselves in front of the laboratory table. All of them had intensive knowledge of runes, even if they didn't have the innate skills to be true runemasters. Their knowledge with regards to the handling of magic items alone saved Stephen a lot of time. Upon hearing the roar, the magic alchemists merely shot each other glances, shrugged their shoulders, and pretended not to have heard anything while continuing the tasks at hand. Stephen shattered yet another vase, but that wasn't enough to abate his rage. He shouted with unrestrained rage, "Richard! It's Richard again! What else has he been withholding from me? First, it was Sharon, and now it's the princess of the Millennial Empire. Why are all the women attracted to him? What do they see in this prepubescent kid?" After his outburst diminished some of his anger, Stephen turned to look at Minnie. Minnie was beautiful and bright, but she failed in all aspects when compared against Mountainsea, even when it comes to her appearance. Perhaps the only area in which Minnie could have rivaled Mountainsea was her personality, but even then it was hard to determine what was superior between wild and aloof. Mountainsea still stood out as being purer, however, but that was all in the past. The Minnie here, today, had been withered away into a pitiful soul, her former confidence beaten out of her. In Stephen's eyes, Minnie was but a burden who could give him no aid at all, let alone back him up decisively like Mountainsea would Richard. Minnie was very clear about the connotations that lay within Stephen's gaze. Even though she had certain fantasies before, the slap had fully awakened her. She suddenly sneered, sat up straight, and stuck her chest out, commenting, "That girl's name is Mountainsea. Of course I know her name. I even know that she's the granddaughter of Empress Jelen. Literally everybody in the Deep Blue knows, you're useless." Stephen once again suppressed his anger. "I heard that the astonishing amount of wealth she has was because she uses baseless spider crystals as currency." Minnie's voice remained calm, as if she was not afraid of a potential outburst from Stephen. The dragon warlock laughed exaggeratedly. "I already know this. The first time she used the spider crystals to pay, I was the one who suffered a blow from her. Are you trying to mock me?" Minnie gave a faint smile. "She's already living with Richard. That is to say, he can fully use her resources. I'm afraid a single crystal will send your plan of gold and influence up in smoke. Should she be willing to take out 2 crystals, or resources of an equal value, your chances of success would be less than half." Stephen was startled, his face instantly overcast. He'd been afraid of the exact thing Minnie was talking about, but because the repercussions of the matter were too severe, he'd intentionally chosen to neglect any possibilities in the area. Duke Solom had given his entire support to him, but he could still only take out 2 or 3 more million, not even a third of a spider crystal's value. The thought of that fire dragon neck hide caused his heart to wrench. "In that case, what do you think I should do now?" Stephen hesitated but eventually decided to ask. He could tell that Minnie had more things to say, and could even guess what she had thought of. That was why he didn't look too good. "It's very simple. You can't just immerse yourself in your own matters. You have to know what Richard is doing, obtain his designs, and then make a targeted attempt at improving your own." Stephen smiled gloomily, but still furthered the conversation with more questions. "In that case, what can I do to find out what Richard is up to? He isn't going to come forth and tell me, is he?" Minnie straightened out her messy hair. "I'll go. I'll pretend to join him and plead with him to take me in. Richard is still a child, and is empathetic. Furthermore, he has just became a man not long ago. As long as I act the part, he should take the bait." Just became a man not long ago, Stephen repeatedly mouthed those words. He placed his arms behind his back, and paced back and forth countless times before finally stopping before Minnie.
He gazed into Minnie's eyes, and slowly commented, in order to make it more believable, you will most probably go to bed with him, is that not the case? Minnie admitted, that's for sure. If not, he will never trust me. The dragon warlock laughed weirdly, huh? What a sacrifice you are making. Because you've already paid a high price, we cannot afford to lose further. Minnie's reply truncated the dragon warlock's laughter. He stared at Minnie with a dead gaze, but her own was clear and determined. Not once did she avoid him. Women are indeed tough creatures, Stephen muttered. He straightened his body and walked towards the full-length window, watching Flobay illuminated by the moonlight. The dim rays seemed to make the ground even darker today, and it took a quarter hour for Stephen to speak up, then go. But remember our marriage pact. If you conceive with him, and decide to give birth, then our marriage pact will lose effect immediately. I know my boundaries, Minnie said indifferently. She stood up, and stationed herself behind Stephen. Give it to me once more, the slap earlier wasn't enough, Stephen squinted his eyes and leveled another dead gaze at the blue-red new moon on the horizon outside his window, before suddenly making a turn and lifting up his arm, using the back of his hand to slap Minnie with a force that sent her flying in the air. Minnie's weak body turned a few rounds in the air, before falling heavily onto the ground. Blood flowed uncontrollably from the corners of her mouth and her nose. Her face had swollen up immediately, and the fresh red of blood covered the imprint on her face. Her forehead knocked into granite as she fell, crimson flowing down her sideburns to cover more than half of her face. Minnie did not cry, instead revealing a distorted smile. That was sufficient, she said. Midnight. Richard was still working hard in the world of math and formulae. Mountainsea was stood next to him, staring at the densely packed numbers in deep thought. For some reason, she'd slowly begun participating in Richard's designing sessions. She had a gift with numbers and sensitivity for mana that allowed her to catch up to Richard's own train of thought, and although she was unfamiliar with the specific structures of runes, she could use the theories behind sacred totems to offer suggestions. A lot of times, these suggestions had offered Richard many alternatives that he himself hadn't thought of. Mountainsea was also very mesmerized with the theory behind rune design, mostly because of the simple yet precise explanations Richard gave her of the principles and mentality behind runecrafting. Of course, helping would also give her a good reason to stay with Richard and enjoy his presence. A magic bell suddenly rang at this moment, meaning someone was lurking outside the residence and wanted to meet Richard. Richard's brows furrowed, and he hurried to open the door for fear of breaking his train of thought. A woman shrouded in a black cape was stood outside the door, her lowered face concealed beneath her cap. Richard could tell just from the figure that it was Minnie, however, and thought it quite incomprehensible. Minnie? Richard attempted to ask. The teenage girl lifted her cape and mocked herself, I didn't think you would recognize me. What alarmed Richard most was not his accurate guess, but Minnie's severely deformed face, and the bloodstains that she had not completely wiped clean. Not inviting me in? Minnie asked nonchalantly. You're. All right, come on in. Richard had seen the handbag in Minnie's hands. The bag was unzipped, and one could see many clothes and other items within. Settling her down in the living room, Richard came forth with a plate of fruits. Ever since Mountainsea arrived, Black Gold was sending over 50 plates every day. Mountainsea wanted to pay him with spider crystals, but he rejected it. All the services and food provided to her was done strictly by the book, and this included school fees and other miscellaneous expenditure. Just because Mountainsea had an ocean of wealth didn't mean that they'd overcharge her by even a single gold coin. Of course, Mountainsea's truancy and the costs incurred during the Deep Blue lessons were two different matters. Only the midsummer auction was an exception, because the customers had the freedom to bid whichever price they deemed fit. These minute details showcased the pride of the Deep Blue. No matter how much Sharon and the Grey Dwarf loved gold coins, they would never receive more than what they were entitled to. The Grey Dwarf depended on providing perfect service as a source of income, whereas the legendary mage would rather earn her keep in the endless plains.
Having been in the Deep Blue for about 3 years, Richard has also been heavily influenced by this mindset. He'd hesitated himself before taking out this expensive plate of fruits, because it belonged to Mountainsea. However, other than this, he had nothing else to offer the girl who'd just arrived. Richard sat across Minnie, the magic light illuminating the living room, making the wounds on Minnie's face even more clear. It made his heart twitch. He didn't have any designs on her, but he felt sorry that a beautiful girl had been beaten to such a state. Who did that? Richard asked, his brows furrowed. Minnie was Sharon's apprentice. There were few with the guts to lay their hands on her.
Minnie smiled bitterly. It was Stephen. Don't bother looking for the enforcers, this is a family matter.
The two of us are engaged.
Richard understood immediately.
He looked at Minnie calmly and asked a direct question. Since it's a family matter, all the more reason I can't interfere. However, what ideas did you have when you brought your luggage and came over?
Do you actually think that I will take you in?
Minnie lowered her head. As you can see, I simply cannot stay with Stephen.
You're the only one I can look to.
Lies.
Mountainsea walked over all of a sudden.
It was already her sleeping time, so her eyes were half closed as she walked to the tableside and sat beside Richard. She nudged her head into Richard's own before going to deep sleep on the table. He smiled at the girl, but once he turned to look back at Minnie, that smile vanished. An ice-cold serenity filled the air. You heard what she said. I trust her. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible.
Book 1, Chapter 56. Unforgivable.
Minnie gritted her teeth and asked,
All right, then, are you confident in winning the competition?
Richard grinned.
What makes you think that I will answer you?
Minnie let out a huge sigh. I understand.
But I only have one request.
If you think you can win, then please take me in for 2 months, just 2 months.
Stephen will definitely be exiled from the Deep Blue, and I won't be able to pay the fees anymore.
I'll stop being her apprentice as well. It seems clear that Master will keep you as the only remaining student. My family already sold me to the Solums, but I don't want to sink together with Stephen. As long as you help me through this ordeal, I will definitely be like Aaron and depend on myself to survive in Deep Blue after this.
Truth, Mountainsea said groggily. Richard did not know whether to laugh or to cry.
The tense atmosphere had been broken entirely by her comment. He knocked playfully on her forehead, before continuing to stare at Minnie. Only Richard was able to act in this manner towards Mountainsea. If it were somebody else, even before they came into contact, their hands would have been amputated.
Is that so? Then tell me, how does it benefit me if I decide to take you in?
Currently, the only outcome I can foresee is the Solum family growing even more vengeful, Richard said calmly. Minnie straightened her body, displaying her curves that would entice many, before stating seriously, I can tell you about all the plans and preparations Stephen has been making so far. I also have a lot of information on the Solum family's resources and funding proposals.
And, Anne, during the entire time you take me in, I'll be all yours. You can do whatever you want with me.
Truth. Mountainsea was in deep sleep, and had already begun to snore, but had not forgotten to assess the situation. Richard could not help it but to raise his hands, wanting to hit her forehead once more, but he eventually decided against it. Minnie struck while the iron was hot, and continued, your relationship with the Solum family was never good anyway.
There's no love lost between the two of you. How big is this edition?
Besides, at the scale of huge families, there's no permanent allies or enemies. Such a small matter is insignificant in the grand scheme of things. The Solums won't make it difficult for you, even if just for Marquis Gatton's sake. Should Stephen lose the competition, he would have to give up on his bloodline and move on to learn from St. Claus. Judging from his 3 level 3 runes, St. Claus is not even qualified enough to be termed a rune master. Should Stephen depend on him, he would not be able to overcome the obstacle to becoming a level 2 runemaster. Only as a dragon-blooded runemaster can he build specific level 3 runes.
Truth. Richard challenged, but no matter what, he would still be able to become a runemaster, wouldn't he? That is already a good outcome in itself. No, it's not the same.
The Solem family has invested too much in him. Should he not be able to become a great runemaster, he will have to serve for the rest of his life without any status, Minnie retorted.
Truth.
Richard got up. No matter what, you'll still be the wife of a runemaster who's also an elite warlock.
That's already much better than having to forcefully stay in the deep blue.
I'm afraid I can't help you, please leave.
Ah. No.
Why?
I didn't wish to be his wife.
That engagement contract was one that practically sold me over to the Solems.
And it's your fault too. If it wasn't for your Viscount Alice, my father wouldn't have sold me.
Truth.
Richard furrowed his brows and asked calmly, so, are you trying to push the blame on me now?
Minnie's face dimmed. She lowered her head instantly, tears flowing uncontrollably down her face.
She explained gently, who am I to pursue the responsibility? My father just hopes another Archaron doesn't attack us. Alright, I know I've done many things that have let you down in the past, but I believe this competition is important to you too. If you would still take a second look at me, as long as you are willing, I'm yours from today onwards. Please?
Truth. However, Richard had already opened the gates of his house. I have zero desire to find out what Stephen is doing, or even what you're doing for the matter.
Forgive me, I'm afraid I can't help you in any way. It's about time for me to enter meditation, please leave.
Minnie lifted her luggage with both hands, and walked out of the gates of the residences with low spirits. The metal gates shut tight behind her, letting out a deep thud as they closed.
Richard! I hate you.
Minnie rushed towards the metal gates and shouted with all her might, before slumping to the ground. She hugged her knees and started sobbing. Her voice could still be heard despite the gates. Truth, Mountainsea said yet another word groggily. Feeling that her posture was uncomfortable, she propped herself up and reluctantly opened her eyes only to realize that Minnie was already gone.
Where is she? You chased her away?
But she was speaking the truth all this while. Richard went silent. He let out a huge sigh before nodding his head. Cruel. She stood up and straightened her body, but even so her eyes could barely open. Richard sighed once more. Some animosity can never be forgiven.
Mountainsea instantly became more alert, and tried once more to widen her eyes before gazing seriously at Richard. You appear more like a 130-year-old old man than a 13-year-old teenager, but... Richard smiled helplessly, and could only explain once more, perhaps I went through a lot more when I was younger. Although he already had a general understanding of his blessing of wisdom, it wasn't something he could explain to others. Mountainsea covered her mouth and yawned repeatedly, disrupting Richard. I know. You've already said it up 10 times, isn't it just because of love and enmity?
Norland's men are all like that.
What about this? You can be my man, and I'll avenge you. I have everything you Norlanders want. Just like Norlanders would say, I have manpower, money, and such a prestigious background too.
Richard felt angry, but was amused at the same time.
He clenched his fist and knocked her head. Who taught you all this nonsense? Also, don't imitate your mentor.
Richard was slightly baffled as to how Mountainsea could imitate the legendary mage even though she had only met her for a short while.
All right.
Mountainsea was exceptionally well behaved, and even offered her head for Richard to knock on. But Richard did not have the heart to do so. Furthermore, he knew that she was merely doing that to get closer to him.
It's time for me to go meditate. Hearing that, Mountainsea let out a cheer.
A while later, Richard settled himself down in the meditation room and slowly went deep into meditation. The incense from a finger-length joss stick diffused throughout the whole room, the aroma sending him there faster. At the same time, This incense stick that Mountainsea used had powerful magic that increased the effectiveness of this session. Even if he dozed off, the effects would be much better than proper meditation elsewhere. And now, Mountainsea curled up next to Richard like a tiger cub. She held onto him tightly, and let out gentle snores. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible.
Book 1, Chapter 57. A Fateful Battle. The competition had finally arrived. The missing legendary mage finally returned to the Deep Blue just the night before, allowing the Grand Mages to heave a sigh of relief that they wouldn't have to postpone the event. This competition was no doubt one of the most important affairs of the Deep Blue in recent times, and as time passed more and more people had started placing bets on the match. Although the competition was of a more personal nature and between Richard and Stephen alone, the title of inheritor to Sharon's runecrafting expertise was enough to attract public attention. Once she arrived in the Deep Blue, the legendary mage immediately called for a meeting with all the Grand Mages. Her brows were knitted, an obvious indication of her ill mood. This prompted all the Grand Mages present to sit still, and not engage with her. Sharon waited and waited for her snack to be served. When the dark-skinned slave finally came, she was surprised to see that the golden basin only consisted of a pathetic amount and variety of fruits, and her favorites were all missing. She relaxed her furrowed brows, raising a single one. "What is this? Where are all my fruits?" Black Gold came around her immediately and muttered, "All sold." "Impossible. I had enough stock for half a year." She raised her voice. "Mountainsea's appetite is larger than yours, master. And she has already been eating them for 3 months now, so there isn't much left in the stock now," Black Gold reported carefully. "Why is she still here?" Sharon's voice turned icy cold. But the Grey Dwarf was long prepared, as he handed her 2 receipts. "This is the amount of money we've earned just from the fruit sale alone. And this is her overall spending in the Deep Blue." Sharon's expression did look a lot better after looking the receipts. Earning money almost always made her happy, even if it was just an extra gold coin, and Black Gold knew that very well. Nonetheless, these earnings did not make her as delighted as expected, and even her hard work out there for these 2 months did not lift her spirits a bit. Sharon had actually obtained an Isla diamond in her 2 months away, something equal to her annual expenses. But that hadn't brought her happiness either, and the reason was simple: the more she earned, the more she saw the difference between Mountainsea's wealth and her own. The sulky legendary mage put down the receipts after praising Black Gold and asked, "How's the preparation for tomorrow's battle?" "All the preparations are done. We were only awaiting Your Excellency." "All right, let's begin on time." "It doesn't seem like I could get any more out of Solem either, and I'm excited to see what kind of surprise my little Richard is going to bring me." "Your Excellency, should we make any prior preparations?" the Grey Dwarf asked with precaution. "Preparations? What preparations?" The legendary mage was slightly flabbergasted. She was already ready to leave as she stood up, but she could tell Black Gold was trying to hint at something, and it seemed bizarre. "How can my little Richard lose?" Black Gold had no choice but to be more straightforward about what he was trying to say, but the Solem family is fully supporting Stephen. Even if he made his runes himself, the designs come from St. Claus. Richard has been exploring things himself, and never asked for any help from either his family or Mountainsea. "Didn't Mountainsea give him a piece of fire dragon neck hide?" Sharon asked coldly. "He stowed that skin away, and did not even touch it," Black Gold explained. That made Sharon a little happier, and something like a smile almost immediately spread across her face. She stretched lazily and said, "Don't worry, St. Claus is a piece of trash that only know how to follow rules with no creativity at all. He won't ever become a proper great rune master his entire life, and he won't be able to design anything impressive. I already took him into consideration when I was setting the topic. Even if there were 30 more saints behind his name, he still won't be able to win with Stephen's abilities." Black Gold realized that Sharon knew nothing about Richard's design,
and reminded her again, but Richard might not be able to win either. Sharon was getting annoyed as she waved her hand dismissively and said, "Stop complicating matters." However the competition turns out, just announce Richard as the winner, won't that do? The Grey Dwarf was stunned upon Sharon's words. How do we explain to Solem's clan then? The legendary mage scoffed, just say Gatton paid more. If Solem has any dissatisfaction he can go straight to him. The Grey Dwarf's breath caught in his throat. Before he could even say anything Sharon was already halfway out the door. Judging from her incessant yawns with her fist against her mouth, she was likely going to go sleep. Black Gold couldn't do anything but agree with her for the time being. The peaceful night passed quickly, the battle set to start at 9 the following morning. The venue was a personal experiment arena of Sharon's, and apart from the participants themselves only she and the other Grand Mages were present on scene. Mountainsea was seated next to Richard as a supporter of his, with Urizadzu, Steelrock, and her guards behind her. The Solems had protested against this to Black Gold, saying Mountainsea and other unrelated personnel shouldn't be present since the battle wasn't public. They claimed that they wouldn't know at all if Urizadzu killed Steven's snow rabbit in the dark. But those allegations were shot down mercilessly. Black Gold told them that Mountainsea was still a student of Sharon's, and that they shouldn't look down on the Deep Blue. Even if the Solem family members present here couldn't tell, Sharon and the other Grand Mages present could. The dwarf's imposing manner left Stephen feeling in the wrong. Besides, Stephen and his family wouldn't have dared to go against even the Grey Dwarf openly, more so let Mountainsea know about their unhappiness. Both the legendary mage and Mountainsea were considered superior powers, and regardless of the outcome of this battle, offending either would affect Duke Solem's entire life and future. It'd be even more risky now that everyone knew about Mountainsea's background. The entrance of the Winter Wolf into the arena signified the start of the battle. They'd drawn ballots, and Stephen was the first to step up. Walking towards the arena, he solemnly lifted the cloth covering his cage's entrance and opened the door. Outside stepped the snow rabbit that the Solems and St. Claus had poured their blood and sweat into for the past half year. What shocked everyone was that the snow rabbit was as large as a hunting hound. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 58. A Fateful Battle. This snow rabbit was obviously mutated. Not only did it have sharp fangs and claws, scales had covered many parts of its body. What's more, the area not covered in scales was protected by meticulously forged scale mail as well. Black Gold jumped at the sight of it, exclaiming, "What is that? It can use equipment? It's a snow rabbit. Alright everyone, quiet. Begin quickly." Sharon yawned with a hand over her mouth. Stephen sent a fervent gaze in the legendary mage's way, feeling like Sharon was still biased towards him. The Solems had prepared all kinds of explanations in case they investigated into their armored rabbit, but their participation was still upheld. Sharon just brushed it aside the moment Black Gold brought it up. It was a pity, though, she didn't spare a single glance at Stephen, like something else was on her mind. It was obvious she had no interest in watching this battle. The Winter Wolf sent a low howl echoing throughout the arena, crouching towards the ground. This was an enemy it had never come across, so it chose to be both cautious and observant. As a mature male, it was both fierce and cunning. On the other hand, the mutated snow rabbit was evidently somewhat afraid, even before the wolf released its predatory aura. It jumped around uneasily in circles, attempting to leave the arena. It was this opportunity that the wolf seized to strike. The wolf threw itself behind the rabbit with a single jump, biting down on the rabbit's rear end. However, there was armor protecting the backside of the rabbit as well, protecting its vulnerable anus. The bite of the wolf was strong enough to deform the Laphite steel, but not enough to kill the rabbit. The intense pain triggered the ferocious side of the rabbit, and it kicked hard enough at the wolf's head to leave an unexpected indent in its wake. It let out a beastly howl before jumping on the wolf,
taking a large bit of its shoulder flesh. The wolf's own bestial instincts came into play, however, and it fought back. The more attentive ones in the audience had already seen the elementary agility and elementary strength runes inscribed on the rabbit, but it still depended on its scales and armor. Lathite steel was the same material used in rune knight armor, but it was modified here to suit the strength and body of the rabbit. Even so, this was far superior to the natural fur and scales of other beasts, requiring the winter wolf to gnaw at it repeatedly before it wore away. The rabbits Stephen had bred were all as strong as hunting hounds, and this particular one was the best out of hundreds. That was why it could bear 2 runes on its body, its fighting ability actually slightly at an edge over the winter wolf for the very same reason. On top of that, its scales were bred to be resistant to cold, so the frost breath of the winter wolf was greatly weakened. For a moment, it seemed like both the beasts were equal in strength. The Solums were all holding their breaths, and Stephen was clutching tightly to the railing before him, sweating so much that his palms could slip out under him at any moment. Every bite the wolf took out of the rabbit made him shudder, like the damage was not to the rabbit's body but to his own. The winter wolf was already a mess, a large amount of its flesh having been torn off by the rabbit's incessant attacks. However, its own bestial nature had been pushed to the extreme, its attacks more and more threatening. The contrast between the two creatures began to show, the pure predator that was the wolf dominating the rabbit who'd never hunted in its life. The rabbit was only biting and tearing to survive, but it didn't know at all what vital areas were. With only 2 generations of breeding, it was impossible to raise a species' intelligence significantly. Although some runes could indeed increase intelligence, those were all at least grade 4 with few runemasters able to make them. Even an alpha winter wolf wouldn't be able to bear that, let alone a snow rabbit. The wolf was exhibiting its vicious cunning. It circled the snow rabbit, each of its attacks aimed at the latter's vital points. The neck, anus, abdomen and joints were all targeted, and as the wolf grew more familiar with the armor over battle, it learned how to tear it apart and aim at the weaker areas. It even managed to rip out many of the rabbit's natural scales. Although the wolf was bathed in wounds at this point, the injuries were pretty much all superficial. It hadn't weakened at all, while the rabbit already had one of its back legs bitten off, so its movement was impeded greatly. Most of its armor, especially at the back, was also torn, revealing vital weak spots. From this, many could already tell the outcome of this battle. As expected, the wolf ended everything by jumping onto the rabbit, using its weight to flip the smaller creature over and take a fatal bite of its tender abdomen. Ah! Stephen sighed in disappointment. The rabbit was still not a match for the wolf despite being mutated and having fangs. But he was also in relief, because the wolf was substantially injured as well. If the snow rabbits from both sides could not defeat the wolf, then the outcome would be judged based on the amount of injuries left behind. Richard didn't have the kind of mutated snow rabbit the Solums had invested so heavily into, meaning it was impossible for it to carry 2 runes. If a rabbit with 2 runes couldn't beat a winter wolf, then it would be impossible for a rabbit with only 1. St. Claus had already mentioned that it was impossible for a snow rabbit to beat a winter wolf with only elementary rune slots. The injured wolf returned to its cage, whereas the carcass of the mutated rabbit was collected by the mages of Deep Blue for further examination to ensure that all the runes on it were all made by Stephen. After a clean-up, a new mature winter wolf was introduced to the arena. It was Richard's turn now. Stephen let out a sigh of relief as he saw this wolf, but also felt somewhat downcast. This wolf was almost identical to the one he faced in terms of size and strength, showing the Deep Blue's impartial nature. He felt sad that Sharon's bias had its limits, and was unpredictable. It could be a source of light when he'd lost all hope, but it could also disappear when he was most expectant. If a mutated rabbit was still alright, then why not give Richard an alpha wolf? If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 59. A Fateful Battle. The creature Richard released was a snow rabbit as well,
but less than a third the size of Steven's. It was only a little larger than its domestic cousins. The difference between this particular snow rabbit and any other was that its torso was light brown in color, the fur shed when it was implanted with runes. This showed that Richard's rune slotting still needed a lot of improvement, unable to fuse the rune into the creature's physical body perfectly. On the other hand, it also showed that the snow rabbit itself wasn't all that strong. The rune had to be implanted by force. A collective sigh of relief spread out from the Solom camp once they saw the snow rabbit. How could such a weakling defeat a winter wolf? It was only Mountainsea that still rested her head in her hands, looking around the laboratory attentively without an ounce of worry or anxiety on her face. Professor Fair straightened up when he saw the snow rabbit, revealing a bewildered expression. Shaman Yurizadzu opened his crusty eyes, sizing up the snow rabbit before he slowly shut them again. There was a slight smile on his face. As for Sharon herself, she tilted her head and dozed off with her hands supporting her face. It looked like the trip hadn't been a lucrative one, and the legendary mage hadn't completely recovered yet. The winter wolf caught the attention of the snow rabbit once Richard left the arena. It was a gutsy creature indeed. Its fur stood up at the sight, and it started squealing at the canine. Being provoked by such a weak being, the wolf went into attack mode with no hesitation. It let loose menacing deep howls, streamlining its body before jumping forward at the speed of lightning. With one bite, it sank its teeth into the snow rabbit. However, the rabbit that wasn't scared of the wolf earlier didn't resist in the least, taking the attack without doing anything. It grimaced in pain, trying to struggle, but the wolf had already lifted it off the ground. Any attempt of struggle was futile. But just at that moment, the snow rabbit took in a deep breath with all its might. Its eyes turned from icy blue to blood red, its body inflating rapidly as its thick coat of fur couldn't withstand the glow of the flames within. Boom! An explosion erupted in the middle of the arena, flames rising into the sky before morphing into a mushroom cloud that continued the ascent. They only dissipated when they reached the ceiling. The dust cleared to reveal a distinct lack of a snow rabbit. However, the winter wolf's mouth was missing as well, and the upper half of its body was charred black. It took a few unsteady steps forward, but then suddenly fell head first to the floor. Its forelimbs spasmed before they grew motionless. Silence descended upon the laboratory. The sudden reversal of the outcome came far too suddenly. It took but a few moments from the start of the battle for the explosion to occur, and nearly nobody had expected such an outcome. Richard stood by the laboratory, feigning a calm that could not conceal his feelings of pride. The legendary mage suddenly opened her once closed eyes, her eyes turning to happy crescents as she blinked at him. The silence was soon interrupted by a hysterical cry, "Cheating! He cheated!" The dragon warlock, despite being held back by his subordinates, was trying to climb over the railings to charge at Richard. But Richard remained motionless, his eyes curved into two half-slits exuding happiness. His left hand's fingers began moving subconsciously, and should the dragon warlock really charge forth, he would find out what the true fighting techniques of the underworld were. Steel Rock stared at Richard's left hand, before looking at the dragon warlock who was resisting with all his might. His face revealed a sense of nonchalance as he deliberately and very obviously spat in the dragon warlock's direction. The members of the Solom tribe pretended not to have seen Steel Rock's actions, before a few warriors came forth to pin Stephen down. A few mages were exchanging whispers, discussing the battle in hushed voices. Meanwhile, Minnie gazed at Richard blankly from the Solom seats, her face twisted with complicated emotions. The Soloms had turned into a mess, but the professors of the Deep Blue remained sitting in their upright positions, not making any dramatic movements and only exchanging glances from time to time. At the same time, Mountainsea cemented her gaze onto Richard, neglecting anything else that appeared in her vision. However, having fixed her eyes onto Richard, Mountainsea's expression revealed an immense sense of longing, which she tried hard to suppress by maintaining her upright sitting posture, retaining the virtuous disposition that Norlanders were known to have. Although a majority of the barbarian warriors hadn't been able to understand what happened, the change in expression of some of the palace guards implied they came to a certain realization regarding things. The half-charred body of the wolf lay motionless in the middle of it all, with no chance of standing up once more.
I won't accept this.
He cheated. Stephen was in a frenzied rage, resisting with all the strength he could muster, making it hard for the 4 warriors holding him down to keep him there. He even went as far as to bite the arms of the warrior in front of him, but although the man flinched a little, he wouldn't dare let go. An old man dressed in common clothing stood up from the last row of the solemn seats, letting out a huge sigh before casting a sleep spell on Stephen. The spell took full effect despite the dragon warlock's resistance, sending him into deep sleep after a short struggle. The sheer effectiveness of the spell spoke volumes of how formidable this mage was. The old man took a look at Stephen before commanding, "Take him back." The sullen warriors took their leave, bringing the warlock out of the laboratory. Only afterwards did he walk out of the solemn seats, bowing deeply to the distant Sharon in apology. "Forgive me, my family hasn't taught its children well."
"I hope you won't take it to heart."
Sharon yawned and barely opened her eyes. The effectiveness of the spell, albeit it being very top-notch, had not impressed her. Had she cast the same spell, she would have sent all the Solon family members here to sleep. She'd even have a near 50% chance of it working on Steelrock, a totemic warrior of the barbarian race. The only reason why Sharon had decided to be a little more formal was due to the old man's social standing and his respectfulness.
"Earl Fernand Solom. Why sneak in without a word of greeting? Were you afraid the competition wouldn't be fair?" she asked in a mocking tone.
Fernand was Duke Solom's younger brother, a powerful level 18 mage who controlled a formidable branch family himself.
It was evident why he appeared in the deep blue this time, requiring no extra explanation.
Earl Fernand let out a huge sigh, and looked at Richard with complex feelings. "No, the results were very fair. We did lose the competition. The rune that was attached to the snow rabbit's body was likely a self-destruction rune. That's a grade 3 rune condensed down to an elementary one. Even if it was only a third of the efficiency, that's already very close to being a true runemaster. The competition was a test of one's understanding of runes, and Richard managed to create his own while we only stuck to the standard. Regardless of whether he designed it personally, we've failed the test."
"I'm glad you think that way."
"There's no need to be too devastated about it, it's only one chance lost." "There's no lack of such with me," the legendary mage revealed a dimpled smile. "Considering our long relationship, I can consider giving you another slot. The fees will be the same as before, only half of what a paying student would give."
"Of course, it won't be in runecrafting."
How about this? I haven't taken in any apprentices to train based on bloodline. Perhaps you might want to take up that domain."
"A strong warlock is like a mobile cannon on the battlefield."
Fernand's face twitched a few times, before he thanked the legendary mage once more for her kind intentions and expressed his plans to discuss it with the Duke before sending over a disciple with a bloodline to learn from the legendary mage. The Earl indeed had the demeanor of an aristocrat. Only after expressing his well wishes towards Richard once again did he lead the members of the Solon family away.
Once the Solons left, Blackgold sighed deeply in regret.
His gaze had been the same as Sharon's as they watched Stephen being taken away, reluctant to part with him.
Not every student could burn money like the warlock did.
Stephen indeed had no fitting opponent in that domain. It was a pity that, even though Sharon offered to teach him as a warlock, the Solons had decided to cut their losses. The Grand Mages entered the arena, beginning to clean up. They flipped the charred winter wolf carcass over, beginning a hushed discussion. Eventually, Professor Fair couldn't help but stand forth and ask, "Richard, that rune you attached to the snow rabbit, did you simulate self-destruction or an implosion spell?" His voice was trembling just at the mention of the latter. Implosion was a grade 9 spell, something only the Solomon family's 5th grade set that was passed on from generation to generation could recreate.
Having asked the question, Fair noticed how overly agitated he was as well.
Even a simulated implosion would be at least grade 3, and the spell that Richard had implanted onto the snow rabbit was obviously just an elementary structure.
Richard suppressed his own agitation, slightly bowing towards the Grand Mages before answering like he was in a classroom. I referenced self-destruction, but that's not what gave rise to the explosion. There's many kinks I have to iron out before I can recreate a grade 3 spell, so I actually just added 3 fireball spells into the rune, ignited by the vitality of the snow rabbit. 2 of them had differing amounts of delay, so all 3 effectively burst forth at the same time. The life energy the snow rabbit could burst forth with on the edge of life and death triggered the effects of the rune, but the explosion of 3 standard fireballs at the same time would have more than 70 degrees of power, definitely enough to fatally injure the winter wolf even if they didn't hit a vulnerable area like the mouth of the creature. Only grade 2 runes could cast multiple spells simultaneously, however, and they weren't something Richard could make now. Thus he decided to use the method with 3 fireballs and delays, but even so this wasn't something an ordinary runemaster could do. Only someone with precise calculations like Richard was capable of this feat. Just the delays on 2 of the fireballs had taken him a good half-month to complete, requiring lots of practice and luck to get it within the 0.2 mm window he had. However, Richard's words sent the mages into an uproar, and they couldn't help but start speaking in hushed voices. 3 fireballs with 2 delays, and the timing of the delays was controlled so accurately? How unexpected! So many different spells in one elementary rune? Is this really something Richard built? It was no surprise for so many of the mages to be shocked. Implanting so many spell structures in such a small rune was no easy task. Furthermore, the rune itself had been custom designed, and if Richard really was the one who came up with it, he would face no obstacles on his path to becoming a Grand Runemaster. Grand Runemasters were very esteemed people in the 3 kingdoms, and some of them were people even Sharon couldn't offend. There were Runemasters amongst the mages as well, but they watched on in wonder at the birth of a legend. Having heard Richard's explanation, Fair nodded his head and sat down slowly. He said profoundly, "Richard, the creativity you've shown with this rune is quite commendable, and it has your style. But remember that the gates of power have only just been opened ahead of you, and there is a long way to go before you reach the peak. Only when you complete your journey can you have the last laugh. Things like self-destruction are a last resort, something you shouldn't use in most other situations. Putting everything into offense is not the best choice." Richard smiled faintly. Fair's words confused him a little, but they also touched him. Runes really were a two-way bridge. The runes he created would allow others to peer into his own self. Fair had said his piece, but Richard felt distinctly that there were others paying attention to him as well. Chief amongst them were Sharon and Mountainsea. He'd won this fateful competition, revealing for the first time his gift that could take him to the level of a Grand Runemaster. However, this was but a small stop in the grand scheme of things in his heart. He knew the hatred between him and Stephen wouldn't cease just yet. Just like he'd told Mountainsea, some animosity could never be forgiven. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 60. Farewell. Things returned to normalcy the day after the competition for Richard, except for one thing. This was the day he had to bid farewell to Mountainsea. Several months of daily interaction had already deeply imprinted this girl into his heart. The day she was to leave, he accompanied her to the foot of the Everwinter Mountains as was tradition in mountain villages like Rusland. It was only when she was at the crossroads heading east that Mountainsea finally stopped in her tracks. Steel Rock and the rest of the barbarians continued to drive the carriages ahead, only stopping a few hundred meters away to give the two some space alone. "I'm leaving now, don't miss me too much," she finally spoke up for the first time in the journey. "Don't worry, I've always been able to control myself." The conversation was awkward between the boy and girl, a byproduct of months of intimate contact. "Why don't you come with me, and be my man? We've already lived together for a few months, just 1 year, and I'll be able to make a decision. Don't worry, I feel like I won't throw you into the sea when the time comes." Mountainsea tried to persuade Richard once again. "No." Richard firmly rejected,
just as he always had. It was not an answer that required much thought, since every day in the past 3 months he had to reject her in the same way several times.
Mountainsea frowned.
This was the only thing she had picked up from Sharon after spending tens of millions of coins in tuition fees.
Richard! What could you even do if I carry you away right now?
The threat immediately silenced him. It was both real and effective. Even if he could produce runes now, his defensive abilities were lackluster when faced with Mountainsea.
That was how Mountainsea got her daily gifts.
He eventually replied with a forced laugh, "I know you think I suit you, but you'll eventually be able to find someone more to your tastes."
Mountainsea shook her head vigorously. "Even if there are, I wouldn't be interested anymore. Come with me.
The power of our sacred totems is much greater than your magic runes. You can study them for life."
Richard laughed helplessly.
He had answered the same question numerous times beyond count, yet all he could do was to shake his head resolutely every time. He had long given Mountainsea his answer.
"I cannot leave with you. There are other matters that require my attention. You can pull me away by force, but you will never be able to get my consent."
This time, Mountainsea fell silent as well, staring at Richard for a while. All of a sudden, Richard realized that there seemed to be something unclear in the pupil of her eye. After a long pause, Mountainsea raised her hand to untie the string of animal ivory attached to her braid and placed it in his palm. The tooth in the middle was particularly large, with some holes carved on it.
It looked to be a whistle.
"For you. Remember to keep it with you all the time, and don't lose it," she told him. Richard looked back from the ivory to Mountainsea, and it suddenly seemed heavier in his hand. After some thought, he decided to wear it as a bracelet on his left wrist.
Seeing his actions, Mountainsea let out a tiny smile. "I know you Norland men all want to be stronger than your wives. If you want to dominate me according to Norland tradition, though, I can't see it happening at all. But that's okay, I'll wait for that day to come.
Remember, blow into that whistle in the middle and I'll know, no matter where I am.
If your life is in immediate danger one day, and you're about to be killed, I'll come and avenge you.
If you decide you want to become my man, then just blow on the whistle as you step into mainland Clander. I'll join you for the ultimate duel." Richard was completely at a loss for words. The only thing he felt was the ivory being as hot as fire, burning him so hard he almost couldn't catch his breath. Mountainsea suddenly let loose a smile as bright as the sun, saying with a laugh, "If you fall down to my beating, I'll directly throw you into the sea."
Mountainsea's laughter filled the air without a hint of pretense. Still, Richard grew even more solemn as the atmosphere relaxed. "Now then, time for a present."
The girl approached Richard, rendering him practically helpless. He gave up on any resistance, but he didn't expect Mountainsea's actions. She didn't go in for a passionate kiss, instead giving him a long, deep hug.
"I'm off."
Mountainsea turned around right as she finished, taking large strides towards the barbarians' carriages in the distance. Her steps were heavy but firm, every single one making her look like a prehistoric giant that left everyone trembling in fear. Speechless, all Richard could do was wave. And although Mountainsea didn't even turn around, she lifted her right hand and waved hard, as though there were eyes at the back of her head. Her shadow stretched towards him with the rising sun, almost as though she didn't go away at all.
The sun shone brightly above Flo Bay as usual the day after, the blue crescent moon faintly discernible on the horizon.
The winds had turned chilly, and bits and pieces of ice started to float on the surface of the sea. There were fewer ships entering and leaving the harbor today, displacing less water as well. The ships that couldn't withstand iceberg impacts were almost gone, but the business in the harbor wasn't much different from usual. The number of ships able to plow through the ice had multiplied greatly ever since the Midsummer Festival. To Richard the day was a brand new start, but just as much it was a continuation of the past. This day forth he could focus completely on exploring the world of runecrafting, but there wasn't much change to the actual rhythm of his life. His activities, tallied once a month in great chronological detail, still left the Grey Dwarf gasping for air trying to catch up.
As winter arrived, Richard finally made the first complete magic rune in his life. It was a standard elementary agility rune, the one he'd first made a breakthrough in. From the selection and processing of the material, to the production of usable components, every step in the creation of this rune slot was made by Richard alone, with no help from anyone else. Normal runemasters usually made use of ready-to-use processed materials to save time, but Richard started from scratch, all the way at the beginning where he cut the pelt. The rune had taken 2 whole weeks to make, and by the end of it Richard had grown able to memorize the entire procedure by heart. Completing all the steps, he realized his understanding of runecrafting had been elevated once more. This was a high-quality rune, able to improve agility by 41%. The magic formation this time was stable, expanding its range of use greatly. If it was slotted onto an armored warhorse again, the horse wouldn't die to a lack of energy. Any rune had 3 basic sections to it: a controller, a mana supply, and the main magic unit itself. Most grade 1 and 2 runes relied primarily on absorbing energy from attached magic crystals, or using the life force or mana of its host itself. The first rune he tried to make had problems in the mana supply, leading to an excessive absorption of life force without anything to keep it in check. This led to the horse running about wildly, dying from exhaustion. Naturally, he would never commit such a mistake. He'd redrawn the same formation he'd used then. Although there weren't any new things in the design, the pure precision of the rune this time was so terrifying it was nearly only possible in theory. Anyone who actually had an idea of the craft would likely break out in cold sweat if they saw this rune because of how closely it resembled the base draft. The precision of the rune was so high that even Richard himself was not confident of making another copy again. Only after a long time, once his skill had increased significantly, would he be confident in stabilizing at such a level of accuracy. Honestly, Richard did not really understand the significance of his work, and only treated it as a practice piece from the get-go. Thus, he did not pay much attention to it after completion, and just threw it directly to Black Gold for 30,000 gold coins. On Norland, most standard elementary agility runes were priced between 100,000 to 150,000 coins. Just like he'd decided to long ago, Black Gold had ended up offering 20 to 30% of the market value. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 61. Taking Flight. Richard did not know what the market prices were like outside of the Deep Blue, and even if he did, he was not interested. At this moment he was simply overwhelmed with excitement. Although these few tens of thousands were completely insignificant in comparison to the cost of the resources he had used, this was the first sum of money which he had earned through his own effort. Richard only indulged in the pleasure of receiving this additional income for a few more minutes before immersing himself back into endless work and learning. Black Gold, on the other hand, had put on his high-power magnifying glasses made of refined gold and thrown himself onto his work desk. Completely oblivious to the passing of time, he studied the rune that Richard had delivered meticulously, line by line. Only when the room had turned completely dim did Black Gold suddenly realize that the sky was already dark. He then promptly proceeded to light 7 to 8 magical lamps which filled the room with light as bright as day before he jumped back onto his working desk, continuing to inspect the rune which he had only spent 30,000 on. Before he knew it, it was already daybreak. He let out a long breath and stood up, his growling stomach reminding him that he hadn't eaten for the past day and night. However, Black Gold couldn't care less as he searched wildly to retrieve a magic briefcase of the best quality. Carefully placing the rune inside, he left the Deep Blue in a hurry. At the end of the month, when Richard scanned through his bill as per usual, to his surprise he found an additional income entry of a huge amount of 800,000 gold titled Dividend from Auction of Rune. This was on top of the 30,000 gold he'd received from selling the rune to Black Gold, as well as the gold from Sharon's Delight, which in total accumulated to an astounding amount. Richard tried hard to recall. He had only handed an elementary agility rune to Black Gold, and from his knowledge such a rune couldn't exceed 200,000 in price no matter what.
Even if he'd exceeded the maximum 50% boost, it would still only be 200,000 coins. So how was it auctioned at a price so high such that even the dividend was worth 800,000 coins? Moreover, this sum of income did not come from Sharon, but black gold. From Richard's understanding of the Grey Dwarf, he would never give all of his auction earnings to Richard. In fact, he would not give half or even a quarter of the earnings to him. This was merely elementary agility. Yet, as Richard soon encountered a new tricky problem in his research on rune design, this matter was quickly tossed to the back of his mind. It was the Grey Dwarf who, on the other hand, took much greater interest in him. He checked up on Richard from time to time, often to inquire kindly whether he needed anything. The abnormality was evident in his behavior, but Richard's attention was fully devoted to his problem, which seemed almost impossible to overcome. As a result, it completely did not occur to him what the Grey Dwarf's behavior could mean. Richard still did not know that his copy of Elementary Agility had been auctioned at the Sacred Alliance for a sky-high price of 5 million. This was because it was unimaginably versatile in its adaptability, and had a boost range exceeding 35% of a standard rune of its type, allowing it to be attached onto many 4th grade and even 3rd grade rune slots to combine into a compound rune. Such a compound rune would take up less space on a rune knight's body. The more adaptable a rune, the less taxing it was on the capacity of a knight's rune slots. No rune could afford to exceed the maximum capacity, and a certain margin had to be set aside when crafting one. Thus, there was always a problem of wasting a part of the rune slots even with a custom-made rune. Additionally, the higher the grade of the rune, the more of the capacity wasted. The sheer amount of wasted capacity from a few grade 4 runes would be enough to accommodate an elementary rune. The original conception of a compound rune was to maximize the usage of a rune knight's slots, in turn maximizing their effectiveness in battle. However, the adaptability and effectiveness of a rune were mutually exclusive. While a more adaptable rune wouldn't take up as much of the rune slot, it wasn't as powerful either. While there were runes in the market that could compare to Richard's standard in terms of adaptability, most of them only had a boost of about 20%, which was far below the standard boost of 30%. The value of Richard's rune was in the fact that it had a boost of up to 41%. With double the effectiveness of a similar rune, people were willing to pay 50 times the price. Rune knights who were truly skilled could make use of the rune's adaptability to the fullest. If Richard could make a rune with a 42% boost, the price would reach 6 million instead. This was how things worked at the higher end of the market, prices increasing in geometric progression with the rarity of the object. Richard still did not know of all these details, and he couldn't care less even if he did. He was much more far-sighted than that, and would not falter simply for these meager material gains right in front of him now. At the same time, Black Gold was an extremely reasonable Grey Dwarf who would stand firm by his principles. Even though he looked forward to more runes, he never pressed Richard for them. Time crept by quietly. The Deep Blue seemed to have kept to its status quo, except that the people living in here would age with every passing year. Spring had come and gone again, and it suddenly dawned on Richard the next spring that he was now 15 years of age. In Norland, adulthood began at 15 years old. Richard was now already a level 8 mage, and had just completed his last standard elementary rune last night. Now he had a grasp of all elementary runes, and only had to manufacture a single grade 2 rune before he could officially declare himself a runemaster. This was merely a matter of time, and it would not take long. In fact, if not for the fact that Richard insisted on learning all of the elementary runes first, he may have already been able to make second grade runes. More often than not, the legendary mage was still nowhere to be seen. Ever since she had met Mountainsea, she had been spending less and less time at the Deep Blue. She was always traveling the boundless plains, and although nobody knew what exactly she was busy with, it was most likely related to earning money in any case. As time slipped by, spring was here again. Richard's birthday was coming up as well. The Day of Destiny would be here soon as well, the specific date never the same but still in the same general timespan. The power of destiny was only triggered by the tides of all 7 moons in the sky at the same time. On the night before the Day of Destiny, Richard suddenly felt that it was time for him to leave the deep blue. Sharon still hadn't returned, and he had the slight feeling that she wouldn't until after he left. On that day, Richard packed his luggage and informed Blackgold that he would be leaving. He was still unsure as to where he would go, but he believed he would have the answer once the Day of Destiny passed. Richard's intuition had grown sharper, an indication of his burgeoning mana reserves. On that night, Richard didn't do anything for once. He just brewed a cup of tea like an aged man would, sitting wordlessly in front of the French window. He stared out at Flo Bay, lit brightly under the 7 moons, and reminisced about the last 15 years of his life. He'd had his fair share of joy and gloom. Not passing any judgment, he just thought back to the important moments of his life and nothing more. At 15 years of age, Richard had the wisdom of someone 10 years his senior, and the sentiment of one 10 older than that. When the first ray of morning light shone onto the surface of the sea, the 7 crescents disappeared behind the mountains one after the other. The Day of Destiny had passed, but little did anyone know how many fates had been changed that night. An eagle suddenly spread its wings and rose into the sky from the Everwinter Mountains, flying across the vast Flo Bay before disappearing far and beyond into the horizon. A pair of bottomless eyes caught sight of the eagle's figure, waves of emotion stirring within the pools of red so thick it resembled blood. This was a towering knight with a brawny figure practically comparable to a barbarian warrior. He was clad in heavy black armor that appeared to be worn out, with fuzzy patterns of mottled crimson on the body. The helmet was covered with chops and stab marks, making for a ghastly sight, making it such that people would hardly dare imagine the sheer number of life-or-death battles this armor had accompanied its owner through. Many of the thick thorns on the shoulders, arms, and knees were already blunt, not having been polished or repaired. This set of full-body armor was designed to cover its owner completely from head to toe, and from the protruding edges it seemed like it was 5 millimeters thick. The entire set would be astonishingly heavy. Yet, the knight's movements were not affected in the least, as though the set of heavy armor weighed nothing at all. Every move of his seemed to radiate a fog of blackish-red blood vitality from its gaps, something that the armor absorbed back immediately after. With this cycle, it seemed like the knight was covered in heavy red mist. The horse the knight was sitting on was of great stature as well, about half a fold taller than the regular warhorse. Its huge body was covered with black heavy armor, the skirt hanging down to the knees of the horse's legs. As its iron hooves galloped along, one could see the light gold of magic symbol on them faintly. Right now, the warhorse was reined in to a stop by its master. It was digging around the ground impatiently using its iron hooves. Every kick disintegrated the green rocks nearby to pieces. The knight raised his head slightly and watched as the eagle flew further away before he smiled thoughtfully. He lifted his helmet to reveal a chiseled face, with dark red hair and a stiff, bristle-like mustache. If not for the fact that the devil accessory on the front of his chest armor had already been marred by countless strikes and was beyond recognition, many would surely be able to recognize his identity from the head carved upon it. This was the leader of the 13 knights who followed Gatton Archaron into Faust, Mordred. As though he felt the impatience of the warhorse, Mordred patted it lightly on the neck. The ferocious and brazen beast let out a long neighing sound, trotted on his hooves and continued forward with steady ease. Ahead of Mordred, the deep blue was already growing visible on the horizon. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 62. Journey. Richard left the deep blue as soon as the calendar flipped to the first day of April, taking all his luggage with him. The spring wasn't all that cold, and the refreshing winds felt soft and cool when they blew against his body as he headed east, towards the border roads of the Sacred Alliance. The side roads to the Everwinter Mountains twisted here to face north, continuing alongside the main road, which itself was wide enough for 4 horse carriages to travel side by side. They headed deep into the Sacred Alliance. Reining in the warhorse, Richard turned back. Far in the distance, the spectacular constructions of the deep blue had faded out into the indistinct fog, leaving only its elegant pointed tip flickering in and out of existence above the clouds and mist. Buried under that thick fog was Flow Bay, whilst the ever-winter mountain snowy peaks penetrated through the mist, standing tall in the sky. What he'd left behind in the deep blue was not just 5 years of his life, but countless precious memories as well as a remaining debt of over 20 million gold coins. He viewed all of Sharon's delight as debts, which he would definitely return to the legendary mage in the future. In the last 2 years, Richard had successfully earned over 6 million gold coins through selling magic runes to Black Gold and returned part of his debt. While the Grey Dwarf had no idea why Richard was so persistent in this, he more than welcomed it, especially when Richard never argued about the huge difference in the selling and buying prices. Even if there came a day where Richard repaid all of his debts, Sharon's delight would forever remain a precious memory to him, worth far beyond just 30 million. "It's time to go, Richard," Mordred's voice sounded from the front, interrupting the myriad of thoughts running through his mind. Richard sighed internally and urged the warhorse on, catching up to move alongside Mordred. Mordred gazed at his warhorse and nodded with approval. "That's a fairly good horse." Richard was currently riding a specialty of Flow Bay, an armored warhorse. This was a species they'd nurtured for over 3 generations, and they'd dulled the violent streak of its wild cousins without damaging its valiance. Richard's horse, however, was obviously much taller and larger than the common armored warhorse and was only 1 size smaller than Mordred's own mount. The horse was clearly feeling uneasy, but under Richard's control, it managed to move alongside Mordred's steed. In Mordred's eyes, any horse that could get close to his lava and not collapse was a good horse. Unlike ordinary warhorses, lava was carnivorous. During numerous battles of life and death, lava had always been the first to seriously injure, kick or even bite the opponent's mount to death, allowing Mordred to achieve the upper hand and kill the opponent cleanly in one go. Hence, a fair number of powerful magic beasts had fallen under lava, and like Mordred, lava emanated a bloody aura at all times. Richard sat comfortably on his horse, seemingly unperturbed by the bloody aura radiating from Mordred. Now a true youth, his body had grown, and though a part of him now looked like Gatton, he was more handsome in the same way the Silvermoon elves were. Only the constant slight smile, plastered on his face, concealed that his thoughts did not belong to either Elaine nor Gatton. Mordred looked at Richard's sharp features through his side profile and smiled in satisfaction. Being able to linger by his side without concern meant that Richard would not make a fool of himself in the bloody battles that were to come. While studying with Naya, Richard had seen him torture others not just once. Interrogations more bloody and terrifying than the one with Blood Parrot were not few in number. By the 3rd time, Richard no longer needed the wooden bucket, and after the 5th, he began to help Naya out. After the 8th time, he'd even possessed enough strength to clean up the kitchen at the back on Naya's behalf. Compared to the smell from Naya's kitchen, Richard did not even seem to notice the bloodiness arising from Mordred. Despite this, however, Mordred's endless bloodlust was something Naya could never match up to. When he had gone to Rusland to retrieve Richard and Elaine, Mordred had brought with him a middle-ranked, heavily armored group of knights along with 2 light cavalry. Now, 5 years later, when collecting Richard from the Deep Blue, he had only brought 2 knights to accompany them. 2 rune knights, that is. These rank 2 rune knights were only slightly weaker than the entire troop Mordred had brought to Rusland in the past. Even 2 brigades would have to spend a lot of time and effort to take them out. The small group of 4 people and 5 mounts slowly traveled further into the boundless land between the mountains and seas, the extra mount carrying the small luggage they had between them. To be honest, there were many methods of long-distance travel on Norland. With enough money, trained 2-legged wyverns and griffins would be a good option to carry people along fixed routes. The physically larger Moslon 2-headed eagle was also known for its great endurance and ability to fly 3,000 kilometers within a day and night. In addition, the dwarves' famous floating vessel was a miracle created by alchemical techniques and contained a very comfortable interior within the flying machine. However, the danger and cost of the products of alchemy were several times higher than taming beasts, rendering this method unfavorable in comparison. Going along the waters was also a pretty good option if you were unwilling to bear the wind pressure along with the cold and weightless feeling that came with traveling through the skies. This option included large ships powered by magic, which could travel distances over 1,000 kilometers every day, along with tamed Masha baleen whales, able to travel about the same distance, but in a bumpier journey. With the Arcaran family's current strength and status, Richard would have been able to hire enough griffins to ferry them between the Deep Blue and Faust a couple times with the money he had on hand. Only when away from the Deep Blue did gold seem to have gold's worth. Rather than a journey which could be completed within a week by riding a griffin, Mordred had instead prepared to travel the length via horseback. This way, there would be numerous dangers and the length of the trip would be extended to around a month. In Richard's perspective, this month lost was very precious, and its worth could not be measured through money. He was now very proficient in creating elementary runes, and with arduous study, he could still continue with the practice of creating the most basic elementary agility rune and even create 2 in 1 month. Subtracting the costs of the materials, earning a few 100,000 gold coins would not have been an issue at all. Hence, Richard had voiced his dissent to Mordred regarding this from the very beginning, but Mordred had said that this was Gatton's decision. Faust was over 7,000 kilometers away from the Deep Blue as the crow flies, and taking into consideration the limited terrain one could cross on horseback, the distance more than doubled to over 15,000. They would have to travel through mountains, forests, rivers, and huge uninhabited areas full of various dangers. They would even have to pass through 10 or so territories that belonged to families harboring malicious intent towards the Arcarans. In light of this, one could definitely foresee that there would be many battles along the way. Gatton wished for Richard to be trained through constant battles, so he could gain battle experience and learn how to coordinate with rune knights and other heavily armored melee troops, especially since he knew the boy was a budding mage. In other words, by the time Richard entered Faust, Gatton hoped that he would already be equipped with some battle experience. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 63. Journey. Indeed, Richard's destination was the legendary city of Faust. There was a certain kind of magic to time. When Richard had left the Black Rose Castle 5 years ago, entering Faust was but a thought in the mind of the daring lunatic called Gatton. Now, the Arcarans were already an official member of the city. The bards of the Sacred Alliance always spoke of the exciting experiences of the many families that tried to enter Faust. These families prepared meticulously for over 100 years, and even then they still needed well-recognized heroes to lead them as they tore down various barriers on a journey of blood and fire with their very lives on the line to step foot into Faust and settle down there. Every family currently in Faust had such an epic behind it. But Gatton had changed everything. He compressed 100 years of preparation into a mere 3, and changed what would be a magnificent ballad into a zealous aria. Richard was currently 15 years of age, and could now be considered a true runemaster. Although Gatton seemed indifferent to this on the outside, he had long sent Mordred to bring the boy to Faust. He had plans for his son's future, and the arrival of Mordred in the Deep Blue signified that he was thoroughly aware of Richard's progress. On the other hand, Richard had come to know more about his father in the past years, growing levels past his confused former self. Gatton setting the place of their meeting to Faust wasn't as simplistic as it seemed. Entering the City of Legends was only the beginning. Every family there had only been given a ticket to participate in the game of power and authority within the city. A long path awaited them if they wished for their voice to be heard at the highest echelons of Norland. Any new clan that successfully entered Faust would be discriminated against and ambushed for the next 10 years or so. Even though the same skirmishes occurred between established families as well, it was at least in secret ways that wouldn't affect their reputation. This was why many successful families had a handful of influential allies within the City of Legends, to help them through the challenging phase that came after they were severely wounded during their entry. In the past 400 years, 53 families and clans had embarked on a journey to Faust, with only 21 succeeding. And yet, the number of clans actually within Faust still remained at a constant 14. Richard wasn't sure if his father had any allies, but there were certainly more enemies than one could count. The situation the Arcarans faced when they first entered Faust could be described as mass abhorrence. Everyone they met or passed was an enemy. 2 years had passed since then, and in theory the Arcarans should have been in their most difficult phase, but Gatton surprisingly managed to send his best knight, who extravagantly brought along 2 rune knights, to escort Richard. This was proof that he had already steadied his status in Faust. And to Richard, this news was both good and bad. The first day after they left the Deep Blue, they set out even before the sun rose and only stopped advancing when dusk fell. The only meal they had was some bites of rations, along with some cold water that they'd carried on the spare horse. A 10-hour journey had taken them over 300 kilometers away from the Deep Blue, with the resting site Mordred had prepared beforehand nearby. It was a small, unknown town, but rather prosperous due to the road that connected them to the neighboring empire. There were less than 100 families in the town, but it strangely had 6 inns, which was clearly the main source of their income. Riding a horse gets fairly tiring after long periods of time. When the horses walked onto the firm and even ground of the town, Richard showed signs of exhaustion on his face. Yet he remained alert, and seemed to have energy left over. The armored warhorse was a beast meant for short bursts of power, but this day-long trek didn't seem to faze it either, as its steps were still steady and it looked rather spirited. Mordred and the 2 rune knights looked the same as they did in the morning, apart from some dirt and dust that had settled on them. They were physically trained to be able to run at their highest speed whenever a situation called for it, so this journey was a piece of cake for them. But the 2 rune knights now looked at Richard with a newfound admiration, and Mordred praised him. "That's a pretty good horse there, Richard. And you too." They all knew Richard was only a level 8 mage, technically supposed to be quite frail. Mages weren't exactly weak with their bodies, still considerably stronger than regular humans, but they couldn't compare to warriors. Even if a mage's body also grew stronger with level, Richard was only level 8 at the moment, his limited mana making it difficult to sustain magic like Bull's strength and agility of the breeze that would increase his energy. It was unlikely for him to have harnessed additional strength through magic. Because of time and other reasons, half of their day's journey had been off the main road, going through a shortcut filled with hills and streams. The road was extremely bumpy, so Richard was supposed to be worn out without any enhancing magic. The fact that he was showing this level of energy even now implied that his body was much stronger than peers of his level. One of Mordred's intentions in this trip was to strengthen Richard's physique and willpower on top of his combat ability, but it seemed like the original 300 kilometers he'd planned for a day had underestimated the boy. It wasn't all that strange for Richard to be so strong. After all, the care and nurture of the legendary mage left all of the Deep Blue's mages as strong as bears, but how did his horse have such endurance? Mordred took another look at it and something caught his eye. "Richard, you added a rune to this horse?" "Yes. It's an elementary rune that can reduce energy consumption and increase regeneration. It's called Vitality. Vitality? I don't think I've heard of it?" Mordred asked in confusion. As a high-leveled rune knight, although he did not know how to make runes, his knowledge of them was comparable to that of an ordinary runemaster. "It isn't a standard rune, instead something I designed after some reading on both magic and divine spells." Richard drew up the sleeve of his right arm and revealed a complicated yet graceful motif on his bicep. "Look, I gave myself one too. This allows me to regenerate faster. Why not something that can increase your fighting strength, like those that can enhance your attacks with magic?" Mordred furrowed his brows. "That's for the future," Richard answered. "Vitality gives me more time and energy to learn and practice magic, which will grow my power more in the long run. I'll consider runes that increase my combat abilities when my body can handle more rune slots in the future." Mordred stroked his needle-like beard and laughed. "You don't behave like a 15-year-old, do you? If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 64. Conquering Heaven. Richard raised his head and gazed at the night sky before replying. "But there are a lot of 15-year-old Arcarans who behave like me, aren't there?" Mordred did not keep his laughter in this time round. as he carried Richard off the horse and gave him a pat on his back almost strong enough to swat him into the mud before roaring, "You're overthinking things. There really are a lot of intelligent 15-year-old Arcarans, but that's all there is to them." When Master was 15, he was rather silly himself, and there were tons of kids smarter than him. Look where they are now, the clever ones are nowhere to be seen. Richard's eyes lit up. "You're talking about Gatton Arcaran?" "Yes, your father," Mordred corrected. "It's Gatton Arcaran, right?" Richard repeated his question. All right, it's him." Mordred shrugged before saying, "You Arcarans are really weird beings." "So, you meant?" Richard continued to probe. "It's simple. You're already quite outstanding amongst the 15-year-olds of the family, but the tables might turn when you reach 16. The one who laughs last will always be the best, so first you've got to make sure to stay alive till you're 16, kid. That's also why Master wanted me to lead you into a few battles along the way. Faust isn't known only for its wealth, prosperity, and women." Before Richard could say anything, Mordred took the chance to continue. "All right, kid, you have to seize the time now to eat and sleep. Since you have that strange vitality rune now, we have to make some changes to the plan. Tomorrow's journey will be 700 kilometers. Cloudy skies, rainy skies, and clear skies. The weather continued to cycle around as time elapsed. A month had passed within the blink of an eye, and Richard's party was close to reaching Faust. The world is complicated, and accidents happen to the smartest of people. Neither Gatton nor Mordred expected the old enemies of the family to be so restrained. None of them had picked a fight or provoked Mordred, smiling and gritting their way through it when he took his fully equipped rune knights through their territories or even stepped foot in their castles. They didn't respond to any of his provocations for a fight, and that left him speechless. Although Mordred was bloodthirsty and adored killing, he wasn't a rascal without morals. How could he initiate any form of attack when all people did was smile at him, and some even offered to let their personal demon blacksmiths to check the hooves of lava when he accidentally knocked over their important monuments? He could only leave and give them a bag of gold coins as compensation for the monuments he destroyed. So Richard did not actually engage in any fights throughout their journey to Faust. The only things he did kill were passing beasts. Richard did not take part in any anticipated battle all the way until lava stepped foot onto the ground of the Eternal Plains. It seemed like the reputation, no, the infamy, of the Arcarans had already spread throughout the Sacred Alliance. Nobody wanted to face these madmen alone, without sufficient benefits and a steady ally. The Eternal Plains were the territory of the legendary city. This meant there were no more chances for them to face danger now, immediate danger, at least. The plains were gentle and smooth, the horizon stretching farther into the sky than Richard had ever seen before. The plateau was decorated with mahogany rocks, and shy grasses peeked through the cracks with innumerable colorful flowers adorning them. The explosion of color was a feast to the eyes. Richard stopped his horse and raised his head. The strong winds blowing strongly in his direction made him feel a little suffocated, but another thing that took his breath was the exceptional scenery before him. Looking at it, Richard felt as if he could see almost the entire plain at once. The total area of the Eternal Plain wasn't actually big, its circumference a mere 100 kilometers, but it was more like a giant platform that rose within Norland. As small as it wasn't something that could be viewed completely in one shot. Anyone who did get a full view of it would immediately feel suffocated. There is power within space. Even Richard, who was used to seeing indoor spaces thousands of square meters in area, was awestruck by the current view in front of him. He felt a sudden compulsion to stop himself from getting lost, holding his breath and furthering his line of sight bit by bit before he saw a mountain peak resembling a fiery red pillar at the very end of his vision. This disrupted his sense of space and distance, and because of that the numbers describing the scarlet peak in his mind didn't correspond to what he was seeing. It was an error that was driving him insane. It was said that blessings would be given to first-time visitors of the miracle-filled Eternal Plains, and they would gain the ability to be able to look at every corner of the plains. Richard finally knew for himself now that the legend was true. The feeling of receiving the blessing wasn't as good as he thought, but it was still exciting. This fiery red peak was the miracle peak that sustained Faust. The mountain was surrounded by an extremely thin line, almost not distinguishable to the eye, that led upwards. That was the path to the peak, and the peak was actually hidden in the clouds. There was a mass of clouds covering the peak, pure and white, moving slowly and gracefully as if with a life of their own. They were never swayed even by the strongest of winds. However, Richard saw something looming within those divine clouds. He was shocked beyond words as he rubbed his eyes and tried to look as far as he could, and he finally realized that it was a floating island. There were mountains and streams and vegetation on the island, and he even saw buildings, each unique to their own. Is that, Richard pointed at the island within the clouds, and was rendered speechless. That is the floating island, where all 14 acknowledged families of Faust live. When I first saw it, I couldn't believe my eyes either. But at the time when I was fighting alongside your father in Faust, and we didn't sleep for around 6 months. I can't remember how many battles I've been in or how many people I've killed. When we finally arrived at the Eternal Plains, I was dead beat and only wanted to find a place to sleep, so how could I have any strength left to appreciate things like this? I was thinking that since we were already here, it's only a matter of time that we make it up there. Mordred watered down their epic advance to Faust to a few dull and ordinary sentences, but his natural arrogance and dominance still seeped through his words. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc. Please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 65. Conquering Heaven. Alright, it's time for us to go. You'll have plenty of time to look at all this later, Mordred waved dismissively as he urged Lava to move forward towards Miracle Peak. Richard managed to suppress his awe and follow suit. The party took an entire hour to reach the foot of the peak, and only at such close proximity did the 5-kilometer wide and 3-kilometer tall mountain truly show its awe-inducing magnificence. It was impossible for any humans to take in the beauty of the vast landscape all at once, and one had to continuously turn and adjust their viewpoint to look at the different areas, be it the peak or the pathway to the top. The thin line they'd just seen leading to the mountain peak now revealed itself to be a wide passageway that could accommodate 4 large carriages side by side. The road was paved in slabs of uneven rock, but they all strangely fit together without any cracks in between. One could see dense granules on the seemingly smooth surface if they looked hard enough, intended to prevent the wheels of carriages from slipping. The edge of the pathway was lined with a steel railing, and barriers topped with metallic beast heads that seemed truly alive. There was a strip of raised stone in the middle of the path, painted yellow to distinguish opposing traffic. Richard tilted his head upwards, his vision following the pavement. Looking from where he was, even if he craned his neck to the maximum, he would only be able to see the thick clouds that surrounded the peak. It was hard to imagine or even think about the island that lay above. Nonetheless, his mathematical ability did not fail him, as he calculated the total length of the pathway from the gradient. However, just how much did they have to spend for a pathway of such a length when every piece of brick and every barrier here was so meticulously crafted? It was an incomprehensible sum of money for Richard. He only ever felt this way when he tried to calculate the construction costs of the Deep Blue in the past. And yet, this was only the path to the City of Legends. Hey Richard, look there! Mordred's voice sounded out, and Richard's eyes flitted to the direction the older man was pointing to. There he saw a mass of peculiar-looking buildings, about 1 kilometer away. The most prominent characteristic of these buildings was their flat roofs, upon which griffins landed every now and then to build up momentum before taking off. They flew about for a while, before going higher towards the clouds that enveloped the peak. Most of the time they only carried a person or two, flying alone. But there were some groups that carried crowds up, painting a rather awe-inspiring image as the entire pack spread their marvelous wings all at once and darkened the sky as their majestic hoots resounded. One could hear those yells from far away. This is the Griffin Stop. You can get on one to go up or down the mountain for convenience, but do take note that won't allow you to bring your own ride along. On the other end of the hill, there's also 2 wyvern stops and Morse Hill hawk stops. But then, the people of Faust have a strong distaste for the smell of dragons, so the wyverns can only be used to transport goods. Anyway, it's time to go up, so follow me closely. It'll be a long journey, so add some more magic to your horse while you can. Lava growled lowly and started making its way up when Mordred gave the ferocious beast a pat on its neck. Although the road was wide, it was still relatively crowded due to the high traffic of other knights in carriages sending goods. Surprisingly, many of the knights they saw along the way were rune knights, some making Mordred and party pale in comparison. When their horses finally stepped into the clouds, Richard could feel a faint sense of magic in the air. The flow of mana was cryptic, but if one put their heart into it, it was still detectable. It formed invisible, condensed threads of energy. When Richard decrypted the purpose of these threads, it shocked him. These were actually part of a spell formation. If every part of the clouds was filled with these threads, how big was the spell formation exactly? Look out! The door to Faust is right in front of you. Mordred's voice traveled over to Richard from higher up the clouds. Richard gathered his thoughts again, speeding his horse up as he detoured around the path. He found himself having entered a large field. With no clouds disturbing his vision anymore, the horizon instantly widened. He found that he'd come to a large field that was about 1 kilometer in perimeter, made out of bronze rock that even he couldn't tell the origin of. Judging from the fact that their horses failed to leave even the tiniest of scratches on the surface, however, it was clear that this material was quite tough. The entire area was a light gold, with numerous veins dotting it colored a mixture of navy and deep green. These lines resembled runes and spell symbols, and seemed to be making up a giant spell formation. Richard couldn't tell the constituents of this rock either, and he was also unable to feel any trace of mana flow from the giant spell formation. Richard had a gut feeling that he was stepping on a spell formation, but this was something he hadn't learnt about before. Not only was it different from the conventional spell formations he knew of, he couldn't even understand the meaning of the individual symbols of it. This spell formation was impossible to explain using what he knew of magic theory. His attention was soon caught by 2 huge sculptures at the center of the field. They were each 100 meters tall, depicting warriors holding onto swords with their faces covered by cloaks. The swords within their hands were plain and simple, only that there were 2 peculiar runes, both navy in color, in the middle of the blade. They were bowed slightly, as if saluting a supreme being somewhere. Although these were merely lifeless sculpture, he could feel their sincerity bursting forth. And somehow, Richard could feel a vague sense of power and killing intent from these sculptures. Behind the sculptures were 2 pillars, both 100 meters tall as well, with the space between them bridged by a domed roof. Be it the pillars or the roof, they were both made of the same rocks used to build the arena, with the same magical veins of navy and green around them that he couldn't understand. However, no matter how close Richard observed these constructs, he couldn't find any point with cracks that indicated the joint between 2 rocks. What exactly did this suggest? Were the 2 sculptures of warriors and the pillars behind them all carved from a perfect big piece of rock? Who was it exactly that had the ability to sculpt such a phenomenal piece? Richard found it hard to breathe again. He closed his eyes, attempting to empty the thoughts from his head till there was nothing but white space. He then gradually opened his eyes to gaze at the domed roof of the arched door. At the center was the name of Faust, engraved by the same spells used elsewhere throughout Norland. Other than the fact that the name of the city was carved by magic spells, Richard could not find any other evidence of the link between this humongous arched door and the City of Legends. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 66. Conquering Heaven. There were thick chains coiled around the domed roof, falling down to suspend a large dragon head. The head was a deep black, covered in numerous pricks and thorns that was eerie despite the lack of life in the beast. This dragon seemed to have died a long time ago, and unlike ordinary members of its species, it had a dozen eyes of varying sizes and a twisted mouth with hundreds of fangs. Richard knew at first look that this was no common beast, instead a demonic dragon from the abyssal plains. Judging from its size and strength, only the primordial dragons he'd heard of in folklore could compare. Slaying the abyssal dragon Daramor was the best achievement of the Sacred Alliance's founder, Emperor Charles. It also spoke of the unprecedented military success of the human invasion of the abyssal plains. When Emperor Charles was the ruler, he'd gathered a 1,000,000-strong army from across dozens of plains to aid him in overturning the abyss. It took a month just to get the main troops into the abyss, with more than 30 million soldiers participating. The bravest of warriors had laid down their lives to give their emperor and his 7 best generals a chance to fight to the core of the abyss. There they killed the dragon in one strike, bringing its head back to Norland and hanging it at the gates of Faust as a proof of their unrivaled power. Emperor Charles had died a mere year after his conquest, but Daramor's head was passed down from generation to generation. It would be the spiritual pillar for humanity. As long as they reigned in the City of Legends, the dauntless children of each generation would go forth and explore the depths of the myriad plains to forge their own legacies. Behind the enormous arch was a road leading upward to the famed capital, a beautiful city lying atop the mountain. Behind the verdant green of the uneven mountainscape was a city of light gold. The sunlight fell on it rather gently, highlighting the gorgeous decoration of every visible part of the city. The roof, the walls, even the streets themselves all seemed untainted, like it was some sort of wonderland. Floating islands of varying size were moving across predetermined trajectories in the incomparably clear sapphire sky. There was a certain stillness here, one that gave the bizarre feeling that space and time were frozen in this place. The 7 colors of the rainbow arced across the sky, one from each moon. If it weren't for the daylight, Richard would have thought that the 7 moons of Norland were right there in that arc. Richard had grown uniquely sensitive to the 7 moons after the ceremony to Alucia when he turned 10. He actually felt a faint presence of moon force when he saw the 7 moons on that arc. It was vague, almost unnoticeable, but most definitely real. Even as Richard was reveling in his new discovery, Mordred pulled him out of his reverie with a loud question, "How is it?" "Spectacular, right? I was awestruck too, when I first arrived here with your father. I wouldn't have believed such a place existed in the world if I hadn't seen it for myself." "Right, since you're a mage it's best not to look at the rainbow of the moons. There were mages in the past who didn't know about this taboo and stared at the moons for too long. Their bodies ended up lighting on fire, and they ended up burnt to death. There are a handful cases like these every year." Richard was shocked upon hearing that. He'd felt the individual power of the 7 moons stirring the magic within him just now, but he felt like he wouldn't be set ablaze like what Mordred had described earlier if he continued to look at the rainbow. Mordred smiled again before saying, "Follow me, little Richard. I'll show you some interesting things that get your adrenaline pumping." There was a lot of traffic here. After all, this was the main road connecting to the City of Legends. Mordred's unruly behavior and loud voice attracted a lot of unwanted attention in a short period of time, but nobody actually stopped him. Of course, most didn't bother to hide their annoyance either, glaring daggers at the fellow. It was only after Mordred urged Lava, whom they'd picked back up from the stable, to move forward and away from the masses that these people started their endless venomous discussions, disdain and derision lacing their every word. Faust was a brilliant and glorious city of legends, and fierce knights who reeked of blood like Mordred seemed relatively out of place indeed. Both he and Richard heard every comment the people made about him, but he only laughed them off and didn't take the nonsense to heart. He took Richard through the entrance of Faust, straight to a pretty and exquisite field east of the entrance. Richard shuddered right as they passed through, raising his head in a bodily response to look at the dragon head above him. Right at the moment they passed, he felt like one of the dragon's eyes moved, but nothing out of the blue happened and the head remained stagnant just like it had for the several centuries it had been prior. Mordred took him all the way to the edge of the field before jumping off Lava and passing it to a youth standing nearby. The horse was extremely intelligent despite its poor temper, and immediately followed the arrangements of its owner as it tailed the youth to a stable specially made for mounts at the side of the field. However, a huge commotion broke out the moment it entered, and all the other mounts retreated to the corners like their lives depended on it. Even a huge armored polar bear jumped to the side with an agility antithetic to its impressive size, leaving a vacancy in the center. Lava stepped into that emptied space, staying there quietly and letting out heaving breaths every once in a while that were enough to scare the already frightened mounts once more. Richard looked at Lava with overflowing envy. He was a rune master, and naturally knew that the mount was a critical portion to creating a rune knight. Judging from things, it was likely that Lava contributed a significant amount to Mordred's strength. Richard! Here! Richard got off his horse as well under Mordred's urging, walking towards him and looking in the direction he pointed. This was a magical model of Faust, meticulous down to the finest of details. Even the floating islands and the rainbow of the moons were detailed intricately, floating alongside the city itself atop a sizable magic crystal and moving along the same trajectories as their real counterparts. Richard saw it clearly this time around. The floating islands were positioned according to certain rules, in a total of 7 layers according to the height of their flight. The first layer, the topmost one, had a single island which was the biggest of the bunch. The second had 2 smaller ones, and the third had 3, and so on until the 7th layer, which was even lower than Faust's foundations. Additionally, those islands closer to Faust even within the same layer were bigger and their construction seemed more luxurious and beautiful. Richard pored over every detail, seeing many family and clan names as well as magic seals of their emblems on the floating islands. On the 3rd island of the 7th layer was the symbol of the Arcarans. Given their innate weakness as a family, the Arcarans had diverged into dozens of different emblems over the years, and they were still multiplying in number. However, there were 2 essential constituents to all Arcaran emblems: flames and devils. Gatton was the only one who had volcanoes and devils. Richard, that floating island is your father's territory. It's 3rd in the 7th layer, and I think you can see for yourself at this point the higher the trajectory the bigger the island. And islands closer to the center are bigger as well. Clans that are able to step foot into Faust are all ranked, and the islands represented their rank. There are currently 4 clans behind us in Faust. What's the significance behind the rankings? Richard asked. The significance is huge. Firstly, it decides the frequency and amount of time every clan can enter and stay in the Church of the Eternal Dragon every year. In addition, there's a fixed number of clans that can enter Faust. Whenever a new clan successfully enter the city, the clan that ranked last would have to exit Faust and have their place replaced. This is why when a new clan tries to enter Faust, the current clan ranking last will fight to the death. It's a battle deciding their fate, so even the other clans lend some measure of assistance. Richard thought of a question: won't the new clan need to quickly prepare themselves for battles with other clans who are also trying to enter Faust? But isn't the new clan badly injured after successfully entering? How will they be able to hold up through more fights? Mordred nodded in agreement. Yes, that's why the first 10 years after entering Faust is the toughest period. Richard frowned and pointed at the island that belonged to the Arcarans. But we're not last? That's because we took down 2 clans when we entered Faust. Your father was impatient, so he cleared out the clan who was originally on the 3rd island and made it his own. This lets us not worry about battles for a while. As for the ones we cleared out, it's just too bad that they placed their strongest men and elites to block our journey. Richard did not know what to feel about Mordred's words. However, he knew that he still had many things to understand and familiarize himself with. And at this moment, Mordred let out a sudden and cunning laugh. Little Richard, make a guess now. Where does our venerable emperor, bloodthirsty Philip, lives? Richard scanned through the place and his eyes landed on the massive palaces located on the highest mountain of Faust. Here? That's the Church of the Eternal Dragon. Mordred shook his head and pointed to the 4th island of the 5th layer. This is where the palace of our greatest emperor is. Oh? Richard was shocked. That's just the 5th layer.
There are clans stronger than the imperial family in Faust? Of course not. Our mighty emperor wouldn't be the ruler if there were.
Actually, all the islands above the 5th layer are sealed. The first 3 islands of the 5th layer are also sealed, Mordred explained.
But won't somebody claim them?
The islands are sealed, and only a blessing from the eternal dragon can lift the seal. One needs to make enough sacrifices to the eternal dragon to do that.
Sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice? And what kind of blessing does that render? And what's the point of unsealing an island, just for another habitable place?
Richard realized that there was still so much for him to learn.
Alright, you'll know about the use of the church soon. It's about time for you to see your father. I'll bring you over.
It wouldn't be nice to make Master wait. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible.